I wonder how you managed to get pregnant, Caroline said with a smile, looking at her mother. Well, in principle, there is nothing particularly difficult in it. Marion smiled at her daughter. I'm really anything but, for now, beautiful, well-groomed, and I'm still in good health. I remember giving birth to you. It was a while ago. Marion looked at her grown-up daughter and smiled. Caroline was her child from her first marriage, long ago when she and her first husband were still young, newlyweds with nothing under their belts. She was just a baby. And now look at her. A bride herself. Marion shook her head. You should be so happy. Mum, Caroline giggled. She's grown up. I'm off your neck. It's you who grow up, and we grow old. What's there to be happy about? Marion said tiredly. How can you grow old? Now I have my brothers to raise and nurse, said Caroline soothingly. By the way, how is Uncle Peter? Nothing is holding up, sighed Marion. He is still in the detention center, and there's no telling when he'll be out. The investigation is ongoing. He's still a suspect, and he's still serving time. The memory of her recent visit to her husband's house came to her mind's eye, once again immersed in the ominous atmosphere of the prison. 8 months. Peter hadn't. They worked out what really happened in that long, Marion sobbed. But you should not be nervous now. Peter tried to calm his wife. When you give birth to the babies, then you will worry. If there's time. I don't want to give birth without you. Why are they still keeping you behind bars? It's not really your fault. I'd rather be an engineer. Why did they get into this business? Apparently, they're not very interested in looking for the real culprit, shrugged his husband. It's a good way to cover their tracks. Before they set me up, they thought it over carefully. But you hang in there. Everything will get better. I'm hanging in there. There's nothing else to do. Our firm is slowly working. It's the only way we can stay afloat, but it's hard. Peter the First really want you to come home. Well, tell him I said hello. Tell him we're all worried, said Caroline, pulling Marion out of her thoughts. I will, she said, smiling weakly. Thank you. He may not be your own father, but you've always been there for us. How could I not? Caroline shrugged her shoulders. I don't even remember my own dad. You told me he was killed in an accident when I was very young. Uncle Peter took us in like family. He's basically the only male role model in my family. It's understandable that I'd be worried, especially since it's clear he's been framed. Justice will be served. All we can do is wait for him to come home. You're golden, said Marion, gently stroking her daughter's hand. I know. All right, Mom, I'm off. There's so much to do for the wedding. Who would have thought it would be such a hassle? Caroline kissed her mom and ran off, leaving Marion alone in the bedroom of their flat. A dilemma, she said, stroking her voluminous belly, whether to go to my daughter's wedding or to the hospital. With so many exciting occasions to worry about, Marion constantly felt out of sorts. She was worried about her husband, afraid of future labor. Is it a joke to carry 3 at such an age? And she was worried about Caroline's fate, altogether pressed on the fragile shoulders of a woman, making her cautiously think about the future. A phone call interrupted her unhappy thoughts. Hello, Ashley, Marion answered, trying to make her voice sound businesslike. Hello, I'm here on business. You don't call for nothing, said Marion, trying to get a sense from her assistant's voice how serious the problems on the farm were. Profits are down again, Ashley said sadly. It's not surprising. We're a very small business, and this kind of downturn is normal. No, I'm pretty sure it's the work of the Black Raiders, Ashley said sadly. Ever since Peter was arrested, things have been getting worse. And I have a suspicion that the same people who are currently rocking our little business are involved in the frame-up that got our boss locked up. So what do we do? Marion asked in a low voice. I don't know yet. I'm just keeping you informed so you're ready. Ashley hung up the phone, leaving Marion to ponder what he had said. Okay, life doesn't stand still. We'll figure it out somehow. Marion shook herself, pushing the gloomy thoughts away. Longing and fear lurked somewhere in the depths of her soul, scratching her insides with sharp claws, but there was no time to drown in worries. After all, her only daughter had finally found her happiness and was getting ready to get married. Oh, I've got to get in touch with these, Marion grumbled, remembering her planned call to her future matchmakers. Potential relatives were very unpleasant people, so every conversation with them became a kind of test for Marion. Taking a deep breath, she dialed the necessary number. Who is calling? Our favorite light of the struggle for rights. Joyce's mocking voice came from the speaker after a couple of rings. Hello to you too, Marion exhaled heavily. Actually, I'm not a beggar yet, and you, as future relatives, could behave more politely. We didn't ask for your family. Caroline is having an affair with a boy. We're not interfering. Let him make his own mistakes. But no one's going to smile in your face, Joyce said sassily. All right, never mind. I just wanted to ask you about the wedding. It's going to be in a restaurant, isn't it? Of course it is. We're wealthy people after all, so we can pay for a proper venue. Look, Joyce, don't be rude. I don't have the energy or the desire to talk to you either. Just tell me where the wedding is to be held, and we'll go on ignoring each other, said Marion, hardly containing her anger. As if anyone had invited you to it, said Joyce, with feigned surprise. What do you mean? Literally. We don't need people like you on holidays. You'll only spoil the mood, came the insolent voice. Well, I've no time to talk to you. Don't ever call again. Joyce hung up. Marion sighed bitterly in response. Not understanding such sincere dislike on the part of her future relatives, she settled back in her chair, breathing heavily and stroking her stomach. Would they really do such a mean thing? Marion said, shaking her head in disbelief. Suddenly the doorbell rang in the corridor, startling her. Was it Caroline? I forgot my keys again, Marion muttered. Come in, it's open. The front door swung open. Cautious footsteps were heard. Marion, hello. This is Nicholas, came the voice of a young man in the hall. Ah, Nicholas. Hello, she answered in surprise. Come into the bedroom, I'm not meeting you, sorry. Sorry for disturbing you, I just wanted to meet Caroline, I was passing by, said the groom to his daughter, passing into the room. Yes, she's already gone. Call. Maybe she's not far away, Marion smiled at the young man. Surprisingly, Nicholas, unlike his parents, was a normal man, a doctor by profession, recently graduated from university and internship. Is everything all right? Marion asked. Thank you. Everything's fine. I like working there, even though it's a simple clinic. My parents insist that I go to a private center. They say the pay is better there. But I just want to help people without any selfishness. How's your health? I see the babies are on the way. You're right. Soon to give birth, smiled Marion. I'm fine. I'm in the same maternity hospital where Caroline gave birth. It's not easy, of course, but what can you do? My body's still strong. I hope I can manage. But if you need anything, let me know right away. And I'll help you in any way I can, Nicholas said, shaking her hand. He is probably the only one in the family who behaves decently towards me, thought Marion. She was pleased to realize that Caroline was marrying a good man. Their relationship was clearly built on mutual love, tenderness, and trust. Well, I'll go then. I have a lot to do today, Nicholas apologized. Of course, don't worry. He started to go out as he suddenly slapped himself on the forehead and turned round. I almost forgot. Here's your invitation. He held out a glossy sheet with a picture of a white dove on it. Oh, thank you. I do not even know the address of the restaurant, Marion smiled sadly. I'm sorry that your parents are treating you like this. That's all right. The main thing is that you and Caroline should be happy, she said. I'll talk to them, Nicholas nodded firmly. It's not right that they didn't even want to invite you. You're family now, after all. Thank you, said Marion, almost tearfully. Don't worry too much. As long as Caroline is happy. And I'll sort it out, said now. Nicholas promised his future mother-in-law to say goodbye. When Nicholas left Marion's flat, she felt a pleasant warmth in her chest. The care on the part of the guy was pleasant to her. Even if communication with his parents did not work out, the happiness of his daughter was the only ray of light in the midst of all these worries and turmoil. At least she knew that Carolina would be fine. It had been blizzarding since this morning. It's unlucky with the weather, Marion shook her head, looking out of the taxi window. The date of Caroline and Nicholas's wedding was at hand. It had been snowing all the day before, and today the weather was clearly not going to calm down. In fact, the harsh elements threatened to turn into a real blizzard to finally cover all the streets. You've chosen an uneasy place, the taxi driver grinned as he drove around another snowdrift that had spontaneously formed on the motorway. It's a very important day, Marion replied. She paid for the journey, carefully got out of the cab and headed towards the restaurant doors. Hello, may I take your coat? One of the staff said politely when she met Marion at the door. Thank you, she said, embarrassed, holding out the garment. The fun is already in full swing. Come in, take a table, the young man smiled. The restaurant hall had long ago been filled with guests, music, and joyful bustle. It was a surprisingly luxurious ceremony. The entire space was decorated with fresh flowers, and the invitees flaunted expensive suits and gold and diamond jewelry. It's like a white crow in here, Marion muttered, feeling completely out of place. Her clothes were not cheap either, but they did not compare with the glamour of these rich men. "Well, little one," she stroked her belly soothingly, "let your little sister celebrate in peace, and then we'll celebrate your birthday." The children were already starting to jostle, as if to tell their mother that there was not much time left. "It must be the excitement," said Marian, trying to breathe deeply, as she had learnt in the preparatory course. She walked cautiously past the guests, sitting down in the most secluded corner, at a table that no one had yet occupied. The plan was simple: to sit quietly, without disturbing anyone, in the background, watching the happiness of the newlyweds from afar. She didn't want to talk to anyone, just to give Caroline and Nicholas her parental blessing and wish them happiness. "Hello, can I get you anything?" The waiter came to her and asked. "Water, if I may." Marian smiled. "Shall I tell the groom's parents that you have arrived?" he asked. No, not at all. Why should I distract them from the celebration?" Marian pressed her lips together. She did not wish to cross her rich matchmakers, who were acting as if they were the masters of life, but her wish was not to be fulfilled. "Who do I see?" "Oh my goodness. How did you find us?" "I wondered," Joyce said in a drunken voice. The waiter immediately disappeared, leaving Marian alone with her future relatives. She came to say hello. She was shy. "Jonathan, Nicholas's father?" asked boorishly. "I didn't want to interfere with your holiday." Marian tried to play a polite tone. "How could it interfere?" "On the contrary, such a circus. Almost 50, and knocked up triplets." "Oh my," Joyce exclaimed deliberately loudly, drawing attention to her snide joke. "Let's not quarrel today," said Marian, trying not to react to the teasing. "No one's fighting," Jonathan said sweetly. "It is a great honor to share something with a prisoner's wife." "That's right, she got it from a criminal. Now she's trying to get into decent society," said the wife. "Don't you dare speak ill of Peter. He didn't do anything to you. He was investigated for forgery. He was framed, accused quite unjustly," Marian said. "I could bear to be insulted, but I will not allow my husband to be insulted." Oh, how scary. "What will you do?" Joyce asked angrily. "You know what? Don't answer that. You'll get your chance to speak up." With these words, Joyce walked towards the small stage, swaying and almost shoving the assembled guests. With great difficulty, she climbed onto the dais, picked up the microphone, prepared for the toasts, and announced, "Ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the mother of our dear bride. A convict's slutty mistress got him pregnant with triplets. You heard right. The bride's mum. Today she marries her daughter, and tomorrow." Marian covered her face with the palm of her hand, feeling the color flooding her cheeks. She was now terribly ashamed of Joyce's behavior in front of people. She was also ashamed of having to listen to all these insults. Caroline didn't deserve such memories of the happiest day of her life, but it seemed the drunken Nicholas family hadn't had enough of the humiliation. "Well, let this beautiful, quote-unquote, woman share her life, wisdom, and set our newlyweds on the right path," Joyce said contentedly. At the behest of the hostess, a waiter immediately rushed to Marian, handing her a microphone for congratulations. Wishing to fall through the ground, Marian nevertheless stood up from the table and smiled at the guests who turned round at her. "Thank you for this opportunity," she said, trying to calm the tremor in her voice. "I would really like to congratulate our children on this beautiful day." Joyce smiled contentedly, looking at the embarrassed faces of the guests and clearly enjoying Marian's embarrassment in front of the crowd. "May your days never be marred by sadness. May you never know injustice, persecution, or offense. May your journey through life be easy. And you know, no matter how difficult things are ahead, only good things will be waiting for you." Marian lowered the microphone, looking only at Caroline and Nicholas. In her speech, she tried not to insult the rich matchmakers, though she dropped hints answers to the accusations Joyce had made. Today was a day of joy for the young ones, and to turn it into an ugly squabble would simply be unfair. "What a tremendous, touching monologue," Joyce exhaled swaggeringly. "It must be the socializing with convicts." Marian had no intention of listening to the mockery. "I've already done the most important thing. I've congratulated Caroline and Nicholas. I can leave," she thought, rising resolutely from the table. "Where are you going?" Joyce's disgruntled voice sounded. "Goodbye," Marian breathed out. After a moment's silence, she felt that something was going wrong. The pain in her stomach increased. She felt dizzy and her heart began to pound frantically. "Are you all right?" One of the waiters jumped up to Marian. "Yeah, my eyes just went black." Marian immediately lost her balance and sank down, sliding her shoulder against the wall. "I think she's in labor," said the waiter, supporting Marian from falling. "We should call a doctor." Concernedly spoke one of the guests. They all stopped paying attention to Joyce's antics and crowded round the unconscious Marion. That's the last thing we need. Now this pregnant woman's got to be served here, Joyce spluttered. Mom, came Caroline's excited voice. The girl finally made her way through the crowd, ran up to the mother sitting on the floor and grabbed her hand. Call an ambulance, Caroline exclaimed through her crying. She felt her mind fill with panic. It's not every day you get to see your mom give birth at your wedding. I've already called Nicholas said, putting his arm around his fiancée's shoulders. The woman in labor had already regained consciousness, but she was looking round with hazy eyes and breathing heavily. Marion, don't worry, I'm with you. Nicholas bent over her. Take my hand. Breathe. Don't be nervous. The ambulance is on its way and everything will be fine. Thank you, son, Marion whispered. The guests whispered worriedly from the unfolding picture in the restaurant. Everyone began to miss the festivities. Half an hour had passed. The ambulance was still not coming. I can't go on, whispered Marion. Her face was pale, her forehead was sweating, and her heart was racing. It seemed she was close to going into labor right here. Well, what's the matter? The doctors are stuck halfway here because of the traffic jam, Nicholas said quietly. On the road. No surprise in a blizzard like this. Why did we agree to this restaurant in a country manner? Caroline whispered desperately. She spoke in a low voice, so as not to add to the bad news to her mother, who was already having a hard time. What are we going to do without doctors, without midwives? There isn't even a bed, Caroline whispered quietly. Well, there is one doctor here, Nicholas nodded confidently. I'm a surgeon. Did they teach you how to deliver babies? Well, of course. And I have a pretty broad profile. Don't worry, I can handle it. The young men looked at the woman in labor, who seemed to have gone even paler. Marion herself realized that she could not bear it any longer. Therefore, meeting her son-in-law's gaze, Marion nodded confidently, showing that she was ready to trust him with her life and the lives of the babies. Well, I'll be there to help if necessary, Caroline exhaled. So, Marion, you will have to give birth on your own, Nicholas smiled confidently. Don't worry, I'll help you. There was a look of fear on her face, but looking at the way Nicholas confidently gives orders to voluntary helpers, she even believed that the young doctor knows what he is doing now. Besides, she had no other choice. Well done, Marion. It's over, Nicholas exhaled, taking the last baby. Caroline immediately picked up the baby brother and began to wrap him carefully in the prepared towel. Are the children all right? Marion asked in a weak voice. Yes, they are just fine, Nicholas nodded. They are healthy. Everything is as it should be. Our labor could be put in the textbook of extreme situations, but in the end, everyone got through it. That's the main thing. Marion tried to smile, but all her energy was spent on the birth. 3 of ours, she did not know how to express her gratitude to her son-in-law. Along with that, Marion was slightly embarrassed at the way her daughter's husband had seen her at his own wedding. The ambulance is here, said the waiter, as he entered the room where Marion had been taken. Well, let them come in with stretchers and carefully transport Marion and the children, and then into the hospital, Nicholas ordered. The main danger had passed, and he could safely entrust Marion's life to the professionals. Thank you, she whispered, and closed her eyes. Her body needed rest. Marion herself did not notice how she lost consciousness. But this time without fear, knowing that help had arrived. Come on, you need to rest too, Caroline said, hugging her husband. Yes, I do. Well, let's celebrate the wedding and celebrate your brother's birthday, Nicholas smiled. The newlyweds went out into the hall and even shuddered at the flurry of applause that fell on them. Bravo, shouted one of the guests. What a groom, a real healer. I wish we had such a son-in-law. The invited guests applauded, honoring Nicholas's medical skills. No one expected such an outcome, but the young surgeon did brilliantly. Shit, it's a laughing matter, said Caroline. I love my mom. But the wedding was a bit of a mess. I'm sorry. It's probably my fault too, Nicholas said, stroking her cheek. It's all right. It'll give us something to remember, and 2 events to celebrate at once. Yes, we are good. Giving birth to 3 is something not everyone can do. Caroline shook her head. I don't know how I'll decide to have one. It'll be all right. You'll understand when the time comes, and then we'll discuss everything. Nicholas kissed her. No one is rushing you to have children, as long as we live the way we want, at our own pleasure. Hello, Mom, how are you doing? Caroline said into the phone. After giving birth, Marion slept for several days, recovering her strength. After such a difficult ordeal, the doctors hooked her up to all sorts of machines. put her on drips of medication, and surrounded her with the best possible care. "Everything is fine, my daughter," said Marion, who was finally allowed to use the phone. "Tell Nicholas thank you. Such a nice place for me, and equipment, and a separate room. As a tsarevna here I lie." "That's good. Get some rest." "You're a good girl," said her daughter cheerfully. "I'm sorry that your wedding was disrupted. I'm embarrassed." "Don't worry, it's okay. We, after you went to the hospital, continued to go out," said Caroline, hurrying to reassure her mother. "I would like to tell Peter that he is now a father of 3, said Marion sadly, "but I don't know when I shall see him again." "Why don't we go away together?" Caroline suggested it. "Oh, yes. You're on your honeymoon. There's no need to go to jail. There'll be plenty of pretty memories of the wedding." "Well, get well then." Mum and daughter began to say goodbye. "Call me straight away if you need anything, of course." "Bye, my darling." Caroline hastily hung up and put the phone aside. The noisy argument that had started in the next room began to move through the house and was clearly approaching her. That was why Caroline ended the call, afraid that her mother would hear the ugly squabble in the background. "Why are you helping that beggar?" came Joyce's voice. "Don't you have enough problems? Or do you want to play the noble knight? Well, you better get on with your family. Do something useful for us." "She's our family now," Mum Nicholas said dryly. "Caroline is my wife, and her mother is one of our closest relatives." "What a bunch of relatives. They sit on my neck and dangle their legs. You've been played for a fool. Now they'll start bleeding us dry, begging for money." "Nobody wants your money." "What the hell are you talking about?" Nicholas exploded. Caroline clenched her eyes. She was afraid to move. The argument with Nicholas had broken out in her parents' room, who had taken advantage of the fact that the newlyweds had not yet moved into a separate flat. Joyce and Jonathan began to oppress them, taking advantage. I'm fine." "But Nicholas, what were they on about?" whispered Caroline. The pressure from her new family was making her feel unbearably hard. She dreamed of the day they could separate and was ready to move any second. "She started giving birth in my arms. What was I supposed to do?" "Drop it and move on," Nicholas shouted. "Exactly. Disgraced half the town," Joyce hissed. "Who was she walking out on? Let someone else help her give birth. Why are you getting involved in this?" "I've had enough of this. I don't want to discuss it anymore," said Nicholas. "I sincerely do not understand the essence of your accusations, and perhaps I prefer to remain silent." Nicholas went into Caroline's room, slammed the door behind him defiantly, and turned the latch of the lock. Joyce continued to rage outside, shouting insults and literally choking on her anger. "It's going to be all right," Nicholas said, hugging his wife. "We'll move out soon and never go back to this madhouse." Marion, clutching the phone in her hand, felt uneasy. Her daughter had ended the conversation too quickly, and Caroline had spoken in a deliberately relaxed voice. Maybe it was the honeymoon thing. But Marion was willing to bet that restless Joyce had found some way to mess up her unloved daughter-in-law's life. How could she help? "Left her alone to the bloodsuckers," she whispered. Suddenly the phone vibrated in her hand again, showing an incoming call from an unknown number. "Hello," said Marion warily, listening to the sounds on the other end of the wire. "Darling, it's me." Peter, came her husband's voice from the speaker. "What? How are you? What happened?" she said immediately. "Wait, no, I don't have much time," her husband cut her off. "I'm just calling to give you a quick message. I missed you so much." "Oh, my darling. You're a daddy now. Can you believe it?" Marion broke the news. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Listen to me carefully. It's very important," her husband interrupted her again. "What could be more important?" Marion pressed her lips together, dumbfounded by the reaction to the good news, or rather by its complete absence. It was as if he had missed the point, hurrying to convey something more important. "Look, this is a matter of life and death," Peter said ominously. "A human buyer will be coming to see you soon. I don't know who it will be, but he'll introduce himself as my business partner." "What does that mean?" Marion became suspicious. "Does it have something to do with your criminal case?" "Not exactly, but a little. You'll have to sign some papers." "What kind of papers?" "The sale and purchase of our firm. My partner will now be sole proprietor." In a way, Marion wondered, what about me? What am I supposed to do? "Do you hear me? The farm must be given up. It's very important," shouted her husband nervously. "Give it to whom?" "I don't understand." Marian, concentrate please, Peter exhaled doomedly. My business partner will come to you soon and ask you to sign the papers on the transfer of the farm under his management. If you don't, I'll never get out of here. You see, I'll either rot here or I'll be made a pariah. And there's no telling which is worse. What's the matter? Who's threatening you? Shouldn't the police be out there guarding you? Marian, I promise. I'll explain everything to you later, when and if I get back. Peter exhaled into the phone. We've put so much work into our company. It would be a shame to give it all up just like that, Marian whispered. Pity, pity. Don't you feel sorry for me? Peter snapped out a wheeze. It's not a joke. Don't you understand? If we don't do what they want, we'll never see each other again. But you can carry flowers to my grave. Marian only shuddered. Her husband's voice was interrupted, the ringing tone of a disconnected call. Apparently he could speak no more, leaving her alone with heavy thoughts. How could it be? She whispered bitterly. The fleeting joy at the birth of the babies was immediately replaced by a heavy sadness. A dark sadness came over her, clouding her fragile mind with its dark colors. Our creations. So much labor has been put in, and now we have to give it to someone else, Marian exhaled. Their shared firm was a pity. Though it brought in pennies, it still helped to stay afloat, and now she would have to voluntarily give up not only her brainchild, but also her only source of income. Marian, you have a visitor, said the nurse, carefully opening the door of the room. Who? She didn't understand. It's me. Hello, relative, Jonathan said with a predatory smile, pushing the nurse aside and entering the room. Hello, Marian said a wary hello. Where's Joyce? And why are you alone? Your daughter's made some scandal at home to our son. He waved the visitor away carelessly. Don't you worry. I'm not here to quarrel. I'm here on a working visit, on business, so to speak. Marian pressed her lips together. She could have no business with this man. Perhaps half an hour ago she would have taken his words for an inappropriate joke. But now, in the face of Peter's call, she felt uneasy. What business? Marian asked grimly. You should have been told by now, though I realize it's not easy to get word from prison. Jonathan looked at the quiet nurse expressively. Jonathan looked at the quiet nurse, who perked up, stopped eavesdropping, and quickly disappeared from the room. Anyway, matchmaker, let's settle this with your firm quickly. I'll leave you alone. I'm Peter's business partner now, or rather, I'm a buyer for your cheap office. There you are, Marian said, confused. Why on earth did you have anything to do with this case? It's not surprising, said Jonathan. I make money from companies like this. I buy them for a penny, restore them to a decent condition, and then sell them to new owners. By the way, you don't really own it anymore. What do you mean? She was indignant. I haven't signed anything yet. But your husband did. It's a little raider takeover. Your consent was missed, you know. But your firm is being sold to me for cheap by the new owners. Now you're the only one left to sign. And if I don't sign? Marian frowned. Marian, you know that you think. Jonathan didn't finish. He simply slid his thumb across her throat, enjoyed the effect, and handed her a cardboard folder containing several copies of the business management agreement. Come on, come on. We're running out of time. You're the one who's resting, and I'm the one who's busy, Jonathan urged her. Marian could hardly hold back her tears when she took the pen. The signature was uneven. Her hands were shaking too much. It was heartbreaking to see the labor of several years being taken away from her for a ridiculous, symbolic sum. Well done, Jonathan praised her when she received the signature. The money will be on the card. Well, take care. Marian looked at the matchmaker with hatred, but he paid no attention to her. Whistling a merry little tune, he headed for the exit. He did not care at all about other people's fates and broken lives. After all, the main thing for this businessman was always money. Dad, what are you doing? How did you buy out Marian's company? And why are you doing this at all? Angrily exclaimed Nicholas, burst into the office to his father. Son, don't you think that you don't have anything to do with our adult affairs? Jonathan replied unhappily, putting aside the papers he had been looking at. Does Mom know about your affairs? Nicholas persisted. She does, Joyce said. It's not a scam at all. It's just that some people know how to do business, and some people can't look further than their own noses. The business world is a tough place, son. You ought to realize that by now. Joyce dusted off his shoulder, entered the office, and stood behind her husband. You, what on earth are you doing? Nicholas said in a slumped voice. I can't even stand to be in the same room with you. You know what? This is too much. I've put up with it for a long time, but now Caroline and I are leaving for good. For God's sake, No one's keeping you, Joyce rolled her eyes. You're adults. You can live your own lives. We won't even stop you. Fine. Nicholas left the office, slamming the door loudly. His and Caroline's things had long since been packed. Now all that was left was to put a final end to it and leave the house, which in a few short weeks had become an unbearable place. I don't know what's got into them, Nicholas said as he helped her pack her bags. It's all right. We'll manage. I'm more worried about Mom, Caroline said quietly. I'm ashamed of my parents' attitude. How could they profit from the misfortune of their relatives? I guess business is a cruel thing. Not for everyone, Caroline shrugged her shoulders. She didn't know how to behave, so she tried to remain neutral. Of course, her husband's parents had been very mean, but she didn't want to say anything mean about them or interfere in Nicholas's relationship with them. If that's the case, then it's a good thing I chose to practice at a regular clinic, not wanting to have anything to do with any of this. It's okay, we'll manage, Caroline repeated again. Grab your bag, Nicholas. After collecting the last bag, they went out into the corridor, left the keys and left the unfriendly dwelling for good. The new life, which had begun with a crumpled holiday, continued to rush forward in incomprehensible leaps and bounds. The newlyweds did not know what would happen to them tomorrow, but desperately believed that they could cope with any trials. The main thing was to stick together. What am I to do now? Marion sighed sorrowfully as she walked home with 3 babies in her arms. With no business and no livelihood, she felt completely broken. She was literally being hamstrung by injustice. If Peter had been around, he would have figured out a way to get us out of this. You'll see, children. Your daddy is such a good man, Marion said. A few days ago, she miraculously managed to get a phone call to the detention center to talk to her husband. How are you holding up in there? Marion asked into the phone. Everything seems to have settled down, the husband replied guiltily. I'm sorry I cannot help. I left you alone. Nothing. We'll think of something, said Marion. Maybe I'll sell the flat and take a smaller one. Maybe I'll get a job. We'll find a way. Marion, I love you. As soon as I can, I'll come back and help you out. Her husband's promise was the only thing that kept her from falling into despair. The plight of a single mother with 3 children was already unenviable, and now she had no money. You're doing a good job, Joyce said. That's a great way to get a signature. I could have taken you to court. What court? Her husband was so intimidated he nearly went gray. He rang her up in tears. She's in the hospital. She was dead and alive afterwards, Jonathan said with a chuckle. Nothing. Let the businesswoman cry. She couldn't handle it. So she paid the price. It was her and her husband's fault for not keeping an eye on things. So they took advantage of this alleged black raiders from whom we so successfully repurchased this asset. But how favorable everything turned out to be, Joyce shared. Everything is the will of fate. She got what she deserved, as they say, Jonathan replied. The rich men laughed, enjoying Marion's predicament. They did not care at all how the woman would cope with her life, literally without means of subsistence. By the way, did you know how Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Don't worry about them, the grown-ups. Grown-ups decide for themselves. If anything, they have a mother who has nothing better to do now. I'm just washing my hands of it. All these years of dealing with this kindergarten, that's it. We've paid off all our debts. We can live for ourselves, Joyce grinned. That's right, Jonathan said. Both parents were not worried about their son leaving home. In fact, they were happy that they had finally moved out and were not poisoning their lives with moralizing. Frankly speaking, I wanted to get rid of him for a long time, but according to the law, I had to wait for a certain time. Now, no one's going to charge him. The son left his father's house on his own. He didn't leave on purpose, Joyce said. How long have you been planning this affair? Yes, said her husband, shaking his head. If you don't make a fuss, nothing will fall from the sky. You've always said that people aren't important. What matters is enrichment, isn't it? You did it when you were a nurse. Quiet, don't mention it, or you might overhear. Jonathan grinned smugly. Joyce looked round, as if afraid that someone might actually know her secret. I guess there is karma after all, Joyce said gloomily, reading her own analyses. What are you talking about? The doctor raised his eyebrows in surprise. Just my own. What does it all mean? I won't lie. It's a serious matter, said the doctor. You need treatment, and expensive and hospitalized. I would recommend that you go to the hospital right now, but until a couple of months ago there were no symptoms. It's also sudden, Joyce said in a colorless voice. I agree. It's an unusual situation. There's an abnormally rapid progression of the problem. We've never encountered anything like this before, but medicine does stumble upon something new from time to time. Unfortunately, we are not omnipotent. It must be fate's own punishment, Joyce shook her head. Don't lose heart. The emotional state of the patient is very important at all stages of the disease. What you need now is to calm down, to gather your strength if possible, and to start treatment. The disease has not yet taken root, and you have a good chance of recovery. Yes, some chances, said Joyce. The doctor has tempered your optimism. Now that the truth was out, she could no longer pretend that everything was all right. I'm not feeling very well. Literally fading away. I can't do anything. No pills are working. I've been to 2 specialists, but nobody understands anything. The analyses really don't give a clear picture. In this I agree with my colleagues, said the doctor soothingly. But believe me, there is always a solution. I don't need optimistic slogans right now, Joyce replied dryly. What do you have to offer? My best guess is that you'll need donated blood or bone marrow samples. It says in your file that you have a son, young, healthy. An immediate family member would be the best match for the donor. So I would advise you to discuss it. No, she said flatly. But why? The doctor raised his eyebrows in surprise. It's not up for discussion. I will not address my son. It's not an option. You'll have to find me another donor. Money's not a problem. Money is good, of course, but you can't always solve everything with just notes. The doctor shook his head. I wonder why you don't want a U-boat. It's the easiest option. Do you have any idea what kind of donor queues we have in this country? A son is not an option, Joyce repeated angrily. Find another way. I won't be in your debt, believe me. The doctor pressed his lips together, took the documents from the patient, and started typing something on the computer, but Joyce didn't care about him at all. The terrible news had completely overwhelmed her, making her feel helpless, abandoned, and vulnerable. For the first time in years, she didn't know how to approach a problem, and this inability to cope with the ordeal was incredibly depressing. Mum, have you gone mad? Why didn't you tell me before? Shouted Nicholas, bursting into the room. What are you doing here? Joyce asked in surprise. What do you mean? I found out you were ill. I came straight over. The doctor called me, said there might be a problem with the donor, and suggested I talk to you about it. You have no reason to get involved in this, my mother said dryly. Besides, we haven't been very friendly lately. What do you mean? Nicholas shook his head in confusion. I don't care that you've been behaving so badly. We'll talk about that sometime. Right now, I want to give you all the donor cells and blood you need. Joyce only lowered her eyes as she lay on her hospital bed. She had lost a lot of weight in the meantime, and she looked like her old self. I'll go to your doctor now, and we'll take some samples, Nicholas repeated, shaking his mother's hand. Thank you, of course, she said muffled, but your cells won't work for me. What? Why not? We haven't even run the tests yet. Close relatives are always the most suitable donors. We're not close relatives, Joyce said gravely. You're not my real son. What do you mean? Nicholas exclaimed in a daze. I took you many years ago from a businessman. He was dying in the hospital. Like me now, it seems, and I worked there as a nurse. Joyce closed her eyes, unable to look at the son who had spent his life thinking of her as his mother. A memory surfaced in her mind of how she had stood by the businessman's hospital bed, just as Nicholas did now. Take care of my baby, Henry said weakly. How? I'm just a nurse. I can barely make ends meet, Joyce replied timidly. Promise me you won't leave him, and then you won't need anything in return for raising him. Henry, your real father, gave me the cipher for the safety deposit boxes and other details where his fortune was kept, Joyce said, snapping out of her memories. I promised. I signed the document, and then he died. Your inheritance went to me on the condition that I would look after you until you were independent enough to leave the family. But why did he choose to do that? Nicholas asked with desperation in his voice. Henry's wife, your mother, had died a little earlier in an assassination attempt. He was afraid the killers would get to you too, so I took you in. Then I found you a father, the manager of your businessman Dad's old company, and Papa Jonathan agreed to do it. He and I had a sort of sham marriage and raised you. With Henry's money, we got rich on our own, started our own business, and started to prosper. Your real father's lawyers kept tabs on us, so you went to the best schools, got everything you needed, and didn't need anything. And you decided to just hide it from me. Nicholas shook his head dumbfounded. It turns out I was adopted all along, and my parents weren't who they said they were. He felt something turn over in his soul, Nicholas was simply in shock, hardly realizing the reality of what was happening. If Joyce hadn't been lying in the hospital dying, he would have thought it was some kind of evil joke. But she didn't look like someone capable of lying right now. She looked like she wanted to say goodbye. We couldn't have children ourselves. We were both barren. God must have punished us. So how are we going to live now? Nicholas asked in a colorless voice. Well, hello, matchmaker, said Marion, entering the room. Have you come for revenge? Joyce looked up tiredly. It's a pain to have to go all the way across town just to gloat. Marion waved her off. And how did you know where? Nicholas told me. What a thing you've done with Jonathan. It seemed like a way out at the time, Joyce said dryly. No one knew how our whole adventure would end. Well, it's no use grieving too soon. You don't want to bury yourself either. I brought you some pancakes. Marion began to take out of the bags a thermos and boxes of home-cooked food, fruit, rings with other gifts. What's this? Joyce asked, not understanding the commotion. Such grief, Marion shook her head. I just want to do what I can to help. It's all homemade, and you can't get far on hospital food. After all I've done, are you going to feed me? What's done is done, said Marion, with a wave of her hand. Do you think I'm so heartless that I'd rejoice in other people's grief? I would. That's because you're confused. Now you'll get well, start a new life, and then we'll see. Joyce shook her head in surprise. She had never realized the simple, unselfish kindness that was unique to people like Marion. It's embarrassing, really. Go home. I don't bother with me. Do you know how much money those bums who work make? Let them fuss over me, Joyce said. Nonsense. Those workers are soulless for a wage. I'm a family man. We're family. Don't you have your own thing to do? 3 babies to take care of. The kids will help. They were just coming to visit. They'll stay here. Caroline's babysitting the brothers. Hi me again, Marion waved as he re-entered the room. Hello, Marion, Joyce said cheerfully. A few weeks had passed. Marion, as promised, began to come almost every day. The women spent a lot of time together and even became close. Marion, I'm sorry, Joyce said quietly, her eyes downcast with embarrassment. For what? Marion asked as she sorted out the bags. For everything. Humiliating you. I've done bad things to you. I don't deserve to be treated so kindly. The way you treat me. You come here all the time. Joyce had tears in her eyes. Being on death's doorstep had changed her a lot. She changed her values. I'm so sorry for what I did. You would know. Joyce sobbed, wiping away the tears running down her cheeks. Forgive me, Marion, if you can. I don't deserve such kindness from you and Nicholas. It's all right, Marion smiled. No, it isn't. Jonathan and those black realtors have left you destitute, and we've thrown the children out of the house. That's just the way it is. You should be thinking about your health now, not your old squabbles. I'd like to take care of you before. Don't say that. It's nonsense, said Marion. You're not going anywhere. Please get a notary, Joyce interrupted. I just want to make sure that the money doesn't go to Jonathan, but to Nicholas and Trelawney. What's the hurry? You'll have time for your will. No, Joyce shook her head sadly, feeling very ill at ease. I'm not going to die today or tomorrow. And I, stupid me, I didn't want to leave my son anything in my previous will. I wanted to make a huge monument to myself with all the money. Joyce came the doctor's voice, interrupting the conversation. I'm sorry to disturb you, but I have news for you. The doctor opened the door, nodded to Marion, whom the whole staff knew, and walked briskly to the patient's bedside. So we've finally been able to make a proper diagnosis. Really, Joyce asked hopefully. Yes, you have a rare disease, but it's quite treatable. We'll have to operate. We've got the facilities to do it. All that's left is for you to sign the consent form. Of course I do, Marion exclaimed with joy, you see, and you are going to the grave. It's Jonathan. Tell us, where were you in such a hurry that you even had an accident? Said Major Harrison with a squint, looking at Nicholas's foster father. It was just ice on the road, so I lost control of the car, Jonathan shrugged. Irresponsible, I know, but it was nothing criminal. Good, why did you steal all the money, your wife's jewelry and securities from your own house? But, Jonathan hesitated. Stop playing these games, Harrison frowned. I don't want to bother with you all day. If your son hadn't come to the flat at the request of his mother, who was in hospital, we wouldn't have known about all these curious details of your departure. All right, All right, Jonathan finally gave in. The stress of the accident and the worries of the last few days had exhausted him, and now he was ready to confess everything to be left alone. I just didn't want to share what we had, or rather, what we once received from Nicholas's birth father for promising to raise his son. Very interesting. Go on, Harrison encouraged him to be frank. We weren't really living as a family, we were just pretending to be normal parents to Nicholas. And recently I'd learned that Joyce had decided to change the inheritance in Nicholas's favor, to give all the remaining assets to him. I was just so confused, I grabbed everything I could get my hands on. I was in such a hurry to get away. I lost control of the car. I ended up in hospital. Can you believe it? The same hospital that Joyce is in right now. She had surgery, and everything went fine. And that's why I'm not going to get anything, 'cause she's done her penance, and those simpletons forgave her. It's wonderful to have such a frank conversation with you, Harrison nodded. What about your recent purchase of Marion's company? We recently apprehended a gang of raiders. Yes, that was me too. From the beginning, my men set up a setup for her husband. It was a coincidence that Nicholas met her afterwards. I wasn't really interested in that. My associates and I had already pulled off the raid, and then he bought the whole company from a supposed outsider for a penny. Harrison nodded, taking notes on Jonathan's statement. Wow, what a twist, Peter said, hugging Marion. You don't say. A couple of months ago, it seemed like my whole life had fallen apart, and now you're home. Joyce is well. The kids are happy. Yeah, Peter shook his head, remembering how surprised he'd been to see Major Harrison in the detention center. Apologies, Peter, we shouldn't have kept you here after all. Have you found the real culprits? I don't believe it, Peter interjected at the time. We did. All charges against you have been dropped. The firm will be returned to your family's control. You are even entitled to compensation for your detention. It was awarded to you from the personal savings of Jonathan, the man responsible for all your troubles. Thank God all is well now, said Marion, interrupting the reminiscence. She hugged her husband tightly, as if to make up for all the time they had spent apart. With Peter's return, things got better for the family. They hired a nanny to help with the babies. They got in touch with Joyce, who was accepted as a member of the family after her recovery. For the first time in a long time, Marion was truly happy. After all, her family business was no longer threatened. By the way, Nicholas and Caroline have promised to visit, said Peter. Good, because soon they won't have time for us, Marion smiled. What do you mean? Caroline told me in confidence that she took a test recently, and it turns out that they are going to have a baby. That's what she wants to announce officially today in front of the whole family. Well, congratulations are in order. We're going to be grandparents. Good grandparents with 3 babies on their hands, smiled Marion. We'll manage, said Peter, and kissed her tenderly. Elena begged the doctor to put her daughter under a different name, and when she learnt the reason, MP4. Helen once again admired the sunset, sitting on the shore of the lake. The girl invariably had a paintbrush in her hands and an easel standing nearby. Spending time painting, she lost track of time, completely immersed in her pastime of drawing a love from her early childhood. She always tried to put on paper everything she liked, or, on the contrary, all her thoughts and experiences. She was also very fond of nature. Not a single detail escaped her attentive eye. She depicted the smallest strokes with remarkable accuracy. Helen's mom could always tell what mood her daughter was in. After all, her paintings and drawings spoke more eloquently than words. One glance was enough to tell. Memories of her mother, who had left this world so early, hurt her heart. Helen had been very close to her mother. She seemed to her the embodiment of femininity and beauty, because it was impossible to consider her otherwise. She seemed to warm everyone around her with her radiant smile, and it was impossible not to fall in love with her kind eyes. Helen idolized her mother, and so did her father, although he had a completely different personality. Father loved Helen's mom madly. They had traveled a very difficult path together, which led them to wealth. But unfortunately, to continue to go through life, he now had to go it alone. Mum died suddenly and quickly, just one day did not wake up. It turned out that she had suffered from a heart defect since childhood, but stubbornly hid it from everyone in her style not to bother or worry her loved ones. Therefore, no one even suspected of the disease. Helen still remembered that terrible day when her mother was gone, how her father screamed when he found his wife dead. The girl from fear crammed into the wardrobe and did not come out of there until the evening. The realization that she would never have her mother in her life came much later, when she and her father had to set up their lives together. Her relationship with her father was much more complicated. although Helen respected and obeyed him immensely. "Hello, Helen." Missy Kate was a kind woman. As she was quite lonely, she was happy to stay with this family. All the more so because she adored the girl. Helen was also very fond of Mrs. Kate, and after her mother's death she grew especially fond of her. And today Mrs. Kate was the first to meet the girl after her walk. "Where have you been?" "Father will be back soon," she said. I was so enchanted by the sunset that I could hardly tear myself away. Helen smiled dreamily. Dreamer. The woman hugged her affectionately. "Go get changed and come down for dinner." After showering and tidying up, Helen went down to the living room where her father was already waiting for her. "Hello, daughter. Will you join me for dinner?" he asked, as if Helen had never done so before. "Of course, Papa," she replied affectionately, and followed her father. Mrs. Kate, too, was present at dinner as a very real member of the family. In spite of her strictness, Mr. Sam Smith respected her immensely. "Your birthday is coming up," said the father. "I have a surprise for you." "What kind of surprise?" Helen tensed. It always alarmed her when her father started talking in riddles, hurrying things along. "There are still 2 months until your birthday. You'll find out a little later. Right now, you have to pass the session." Father continued the meal in silence. That meant the conversation was over. No one present dared to break the silence, for he was very annoyed by the noise at the table. Helen looked sadly at the portrait of her mother that stood nearby on the shelf. The woman was smiling a radiant smile. Mum was the complete opposite of her father. She was always fun and easy to be with. And father was much softer under the influence of the charms of his charming wife. Lately he had become simply unbearable. Deep down, Helen was even afraid of him. She had learnt from Mrs. Kate that her father had serious business problems. That explained his irritability. Finished with dinner, the girl went to her room. Soon to be 19, and she had never had a relationship with a guy. Though where would they come from if her father controlled her every move? Immersed in her unhappy thoughts, she flinched when she heard the phone ring. "My girl, hello, how are you?" It was her favorite aunt, her mother's sister. "I'm fine," Helen replied sadly, but then, when she realized it, she asked cheerfully, "And how are you? 1,000 years have not seen you. I missed you very much." Helen tried to hide the excitement of the call. Memories of her mum broke her soul again. She remembered how they had visited Aunt Emma in the village, and the time spent there had been one of her happiest childhood memories. "That's why I'm calling." Aunt Emma's voice was still happy and cheerful. "Anyway, I'm inviting you to come and visit me for the summer. They say the summer will be hot. We'll go swimming together at the river." But as the question hung in the air, and Helen already saw herself in the village, to give an answer without consulting her father, it would be rash. "Shit, I've got a session to get through. Only then I might be able to come. And I have to agree with my dad." She heard a sigh of disappointment on the other end of the line. "But don't worry, I'll do my best." Helen tried to cheer up Aunt Emma. They agreed that Helen would call next week and said goodbye. From the village, Helen had always envied the people who lived there. Of course, they had to work much harder than city people, and the labor was mostly physical. But how much beauty they saw every day. A wide river full of fish, vast forests with their gifts, fields surrounding the village on almost all sides, a holy spring gushing from the ground. Helen had come to the little town for the summer to visit her aunt and Mrs. Kate. It had been a long time since she had been in these parts, where she had spent a happy childhood. Nature, springs with crystal clear water memories came over the girl. For the last few years, Helen had felt lonely. Her father, Mr. Sam Smith, was absorbed in his work, trying to forget himself in it after the death of his wife. Aunt Emma often phoned her niece, especially after the loss of her sister, trying to support her morally, although she was going through grief herself. But Helen needed someone close to her, whose warmth she could feel, who needed her. The school term was coming to an end, bringing closer the inevitable conversation with her father. Helen rehearsed the upcoming dialogue, berating herself for her fear of her own parent. She hadn't seen much of him lately. He was literally sleeping at work. One day the girl managed to catch her father at home. He was sitting in his study, immersed in his laptop, with disheveled hair and 3-day stubble. "Dad, can I talk to you?" Helen asked timidly, opening the door. "Yes, yes, come in," Mr. Smith replied absent-mindedly, keeping his eyes on the screen. Helen sat down in the chair opposite. "Aunt Emma called yesterday," she began quietly. "It's good that she doesn't forget you. How's she doing?" Dad replied, not taking his eyes off the monitor. "She's fine. But she suggested something to me, and I wanted to discuss it with you," Helen exhaled. "Discuss it." Mr. Smith finally pulled himself away from his work and raised his eyebrows questioningly. "All right, I'm listening." "Aunt Emma has offered to stay with her this summer, and I'd like that very much. If you don't mind." Father thought for a moment. "All right, go have fun. But on one condition, you have to be home by your birthday. I hope you haven't forgotten that we're going to have a big party." Helen couldn't believe her happiness. She hadn't even expected her father to agree. She jumped up, hugged her parent, and kissed him on the top of his head. Tears glistened in his eyes. "That's it. Go on, daughter. I have to work." Mr. Smith abruptly dismissed her, returning to the computer. Helen left the office feeling inexplicably sad. That evening she phoned her aunt, telling her that she would be arriving soon. A few days later, Helen was already packing her bags, looking forward to her holiday. Despite her advanced age, she had never traveled anywhere on her own. So Helen smiled as she fell asleep on the train to the sound of the wheels. Her aunt met her on the deserted platform. "Helen, how long it's been since we've seen each other." Aunt Emma hugged her niece. "God, you're so beautiful. I can't believe it." After picking up their things, they set off on the motorbike with the sidecar. Driving past a large empty field, Helen admired the vastness and wildflowers. It had been a long time since she had seen such picturesque scenery. The warm rays of sunshine were folding into quaint islands, making her imagination plan their arrangement on the canvas. A gentle breeze blew her hair out of her braids, and despite the intense heat, Helen was incredibly happy. "Go into the hay," darling, said her aunt. "It's much cooler in here. It's very stuffy in the hut." After unpacking, Helen stepped out onto the porch and looked at the familiar but almost forgotten shapes of the neighbors' houses. Nothing seemed to have changed since the days when she had visited with her mother. "Let's go to dinner, dear." Emma put a hand on her shoulder. Helen brushed away a tear and followed her aunt. Lunch was to be in the garden, in a gazebo surrounded by a thicket of grapes. It was strange, but she and her father had never eaten outdoors, even though their garden was beautiful, preferring to eat at home. And here, dining outdoors seemed so natural that Helen ate even more than usual. "If this keeps up, I'm afraid I'll have to change my wardrobe," she laughed. "You can't spoil your slim figure," Aunt Emma flattered her. After a little silence, she added, "I'm sorry." "What are you sorry for?" Her niece hastened to reassure her. "I knew how badly you felt about your mother's death, but I never called you to me. You see, I was afraid. I was afraid that seeing you would make me feel worse. You know how close we were to her. I'm sorry for my cowardice. I only now realize how wrong I was." Emma was silent, and large tears rolled down her apron. Helen rushed to comfort her. Together they shed many tears until almost evening, and when they had calmed down, they began to stoke the village bath. The whole atmosphere of the place had a calming effect. For a moment, Helen even felt her mother's presence. "Tomorrow they promise a terrible heat wave. Shall we go swimming with you at the lake?" Auntie suggested it. Helen agreed without a second thought. They talked a little longer, and then went to their rooms. But sleep did not come, so the girl decided to go out on the porch, taking a plaid. Despite the hot days, it was a little chilly at night. The fence at her aunt's house was rather nominal, very low, so passers-by could easily see what was going on in their yard. Sitting down on the porch, Helen looked up at the sky studded with thousands of stars, and it seemed that even the sky here was quite different, not like in the city. Suddenly she heard a noise. At that time, a group of young men and girls appeared from around the corner. The guys were with a guitar, occasionally strumming the strings. Helen smiled at them. And suddenly she also wanted to give herself up to the impulse of youth, to have fun and party until morning, like most of her peers. But her father suppressed all her dreams and desires at the root. He even got angry when he saw her with a canvas and brushes. To say nothing of moonlight walks with the boys. Suddenly the company stopped in front of their house, and one of the guys stared at the girl sitting on the porch. Her long, dark hair fell down over her shoulders, and her fair porcelain skin inevitably drew the eye. Helen, embarrassed, looked away. "John, come on," shouted one of the girls, and the company moved on. The young man glanced round once more, but his friends quickly pushed him forward. Helen smiled to herself. So many new impressions she had never experienced before, and here in just one day. Waking up at dawn, the girl took her easel and went out into the courtyard, where there was a beautiful view. After making a few sketches, she hurried to help her aunt with breakfast, anticipating the trip to the lake. Freedom of movement thrilled her wildly, and passing through familiar and dear to her heart, she was plunged into a carefree and happy childhood. "Settled in?" Aunt Emma asked. "Yes, a bit of nature here, of course, is marvelous," shared Helen's impressions. Though Auntie saw everything perfectly well herself. Those burning merry eyes reminded her so much of her sister. Only it was noticeable that Helen was a bit stiff, as if she was afraid of being judged for any of her actions. "This isn't the city. There's real space here," the woman replied thoughtfully. After a quick snack, they grabbed a few things from home and put them in a basket, grabbed their beach gear, and headed to the beach by the lake. The splendor that presented itself to the girl's eyes was astonishing in its immensity. The lake with the clearest water was surrounded by pine trees on 3 sides. "Perhaps the scenery here is as good as any overseas resort," smiled Helen. "I wish I'd brought my easel. You'll have time, believe me. But today, let's sunbathe and swim," said Aunt Emma, nodding towards the blanket she had spread out. Helen took off her sundress, leaving her in a fashionable bronze-colored swimming costume. She had bought this item of clothing in advance, knowing that she would be swimming in the local pond. Suddenly the girl felt someone's gaze on her. Turning round, she noticed a familiar group of young people who had passed by their house last night. Looking at her was still the same guy as yesterday. Only today his gaze was a little different. Today it was as if he was studying her, unashamedly, examining her from head to toe. That piercing gaze made Helen uncomfortable. She sat down next to Aunt Emma and pulled out a book, trying to concentrate, but it wasn't working. So she glanced round at the group. Suddenly one of the girls walked up to the guy and literally hung around his neck. Helen looked at him disappointedly and turned away, feeling a strange feeling. After lying a little under the rays of the hot sun, Helen and her aunt took a dip in the water. Her eyes involuntarily cast a glance at the place where the same company was resting. But that fellow Helen did not notice. Instead, she saw the girl, who now sat alone and was obviously upset about something. The water in the lake was really beautiful, despite the fact that it was quite cool. According to the auntie's story, the reason for this was due to underground springs running directly into the lake. Having thoroughly enjoyed their swim, Helen and Aunt Emma did not return home until near evening and immediately began to prepare dinner. "You won't believe it, but I haven't had such a great time in a long time," Auntie confessed. "I haven't had proper company. You know, when my husband died, I thought my heart would burst with longing. But time heals. I realized that my business on this earth was not yet finished. And although fate didn't reward me with children, I have you, and it's been a long time since I've felt as wonderful as I do today." Aunt Emma brushed away her tears. Helen rushed to comfort her. "Maybe you'd better move in with us. We have a big house and Daddy I don't think would mind," the girl suggested. "No, honey, my place is here. I've got my soul attached to it. This is where I'll end my journey. But I want you not to forget this place either. After all, this house will be yours when I die." Helen answered nothing, pressing Aunt Emma to her bosom. She stroked her wavy hair, from which gray strands were poking out. After enjoying the cool of the evening, they returned to the house. It was getting dark, but Helen didn't want to go to bed. She went out on the veranda and took a warm blanket and a cup of herbal tea. Leaning back in the old armchair, she gazed at the stars and dreamed. When she heard the creak of the wicket door opening, she shuddered. On the path directly to her walked the same young man, carrying a bouquet of wildflowers. The girl froze from fear and excitement at the same time, but did not move. "Hello, stranger. Sorry to intrude, but I had no other choice," he pronounced. Didn't know when I'd be able to see you again. John looked Helen straight in the eye and smiled. These are for you, he said, holding out the flowers to her. Helen accepted them, giving the young man a radiant smile. May I sit down? He asked. I suppose you may, but you'll have to introduce yourself, she said, trying to hide her excitement. John, the young man, answered immediately. And you are Helen, aren't you? How do you know? She wondered. I had to find out. The boy smiled. Helen noticed the shadows in the window of the dark room and knew that Mrs. Kate was watching them, but she did not interfere with their acquaintance. Wouldn't your girlfriend be unhappy that you'd come here? Helen decided to ask, for the question had been on her mind ever since she had seen them. I've been cuddling with Anne for a month on the beach. I don't have a girlfriend. Anne's just a friend. We rent a house near you. For the second summer in a row, there are 5 of us, 3 guys and 2 girls. We're all studying together at one of the universities in town. And this place was an accident, but we fell in love with it unconditionally. John's voice was so pleasant that Helen was ready to listen to it all night. At last the tension between them disappeared, and Helen even dared to tell him briefly about her life. The time passed quickly, and they said goodbye when dawn was about to break. Helen immediately fell asleep in her cozy bed with thoughts of her new acquaintance. Meanwhile, John returned to the house where his friends were waiting for him. How did it go? Mr. Sam Smith asked. Good girl. She seemed to like me. I think I'm going to win this argument, replied John. We'll see, said Ben. He had put John up to the bet while they were at the lake. Noticing the look in his friend's eyes, he said, Nice girl, but I don't think you'll get anywhere. She's not likely to turn her eyes on the average bloke. That girl's out of your league, bro. But John looked at her with burning eyes, unable to look away. He really did like her very much, but his friend's words hit the young and proud lad's ego. You'll see, she'll be mine, he said eagerly. Want to bet? Ben immediately got into the game. They said nothing about the bet to the rest of their friends, and only Anne heard everything. She was very fond of John, and she was following him around, dreaming of getting him. But the boy seemed to ignore all her attempts to get closer to him. That evening she followed him and saw him go to Helen. Resentment and anger were very strong, but she tried not to give the appearance that she knew everything. Helen greeted the new day with the sun shining through the window. She stretched sweetly. She smiled as she remembered last night. Wake up, sleepyhead. It's time for breakfast, her aunt called her affectionately. 5 minutes and I'll be ready, Helen said. She quickly slipped her feet into her slippers and hurried to the bathroom. After changing, she entered the kitchen when everything was ready for breakfast. I'm sorry, I haven't helped you at all, she apologized. Stop it. It's my pleasure to take care of you. You don't know how important it is to know that you have someone to take care of you, she said. Feeling that she might cry at any moment, she decided to change the subject. By the way, I heard voices under our window tonight. She looked questioningly at her niece, smiling slyly. Yes, that bloke we saw at the lake came round. He wanted to meet me, Helen said, and a blush covered her face. Well, I hope he succeeded, replied the aunt. He did, she said, blushing even more. Only I don't know how to behave with boys, she confessed. You don't need to know anything. If you like him, you should behave as your heart tells you. Just be yourself, the woman replied. At 12, they had a lot of things to do, so Helen was only able to free herself by evening. And just as she entered the house, she heard a quiet knock on the door. Opening it, she froze in place. Helen was sitting on the veranda with Mrs. Emma when John came up to them with a bouquet of wildflowers in his hands. Thank you, Helen smiled, accepting the bouquet. How about a walk around the town? I don't know, the girl replied excitedly. I need to shower and change, but I really want to walk with you. Great. I'll wait for you on the porch, John said. I hope your aunt doesn't mind? Helen shrugged her shoulders. I guess not. When John came out, she rushed into the shower, wondering what she should wear for the walk. Once ready, Helen smiled at her reflection in the mirror and stepped out. John was sitting on the veranda with Aunt Emma. They were drinking tea and chatting sweetly. Helen, the aunt, appealed as the girl approached. "This young man asks permission to take a walk with you. I had to meet him so I could let you go in peace." Helen looked at her questioningly. "I see he's a nice chap, so I'm letting you go." Noticing her niece's tension, Mrs. Emma hurried to leave them alone. This day, John behaved more easily than the day before. He joked a lot and told interesting stories. Helen learned that he was studying to be a doctor and dreamed of becoming a specialist in cardiology. She, in turn, told about her passion for painting. "That's great. Can I see your paintings?" John asked with interest. "They are all left at home, in my studio. But I could paint a picture especially for you," Helen suggested. "That would be great," said the boy. John behaved very gallantly, not allowing himself too much. The walk ended in the late evening, leaving both only positive emotions. From that day, the young people were inseparable. John had been picking up Helen since morning. They returned sometimes in the morning. Mrs. Emma did not hinder their meetings. On the contrary, she liked John very much. Besides, she could see that her niece was truly in love. Helen felt that John was her man, and even if he was not rich, that was not the main thing. The main thing she realized was that he had the same feelings for her. Of course, her father may be against their relationship, but Helen tried not to think about it and just enjoy communication with her beloved. The couple often discussed joint plans for the future, where they could no longer imagine themselves apart. "It's the first time I've been like this," said John, sitting on the shore of the lake, which has become their favorite place for dates. "I can't be without you for a minute. I've had other girls before, but this is nothing like what I feel for you." John pulled Helen to him and kissed her gently. "What about Anne? Did you go out with her too?" the girl asked with a smile. "No, although I know her desire to be with me. But now I don't need anyone but you," the boy said, looking Helen straight in the eyes. "I will love you always. No matter what happens," he whispered, not taking his eyes off her. The girl was a little embarrassed, for it was the first time she had heard such words. Nevertheless, the holiday was coming to an end, bringing closer the time of the inevitable parting with her beloved and with this beautiful place. It seemed as if Helen had never really lived before this trip. Although she and John had agreed to meet as soon as they arrived, an inexplicable sadness never left her. "Tonight is our last night. You'll be gone tomorrow," John said sadly. "You make it sound like we'll never see each other again," Helen smiled, snuggling into the boy who was the most important person in her life. They were sitting on a hill surrounded by pine trees. They had a beautiful view of their favorite lake. John had brought a blanket and a basket of picnic supplies. "I love you very much," he said, "as much as I possibly can." Helen looked John straight in the eye as she confessed her love. There was no doubt of her sincerity. She gently touched his lips with her own, pressing herself against him. That was the day they decided to spend the night together. It was their last meeting. This time their date didn't end until dawn, and in the evening Helen already had a train ticket. "I'll definitely come to see you off," John whispered goodbye. As she packed her things, Helen remembered her promise to give John the painting. By the way, it was ready. She wanted to leave him something to remember it by. Slowly gathering herself, the girl grabbed the gift and headed towards the house where John and his friends lived. As she got closer, Helen felt an incomprehensible excitement, but continued on her way. The door was opened for her by Anne. "Could you get John for me, please?" Helen asked. "John's gone to town. Didn't you know?" Anne looked at the bewildered Helen with undisguised gloating. "Why should he have to answer to you, though? Who are you? He got everything he wanted from you." The girl laughed. "I don't know what you're talking about." Helen sat down on the bench outside the house, feeling her legs shaking from the sudden realization. "What's there to understand? John and his mates bet that he'd sleep with you. You seemed so unapproachable at first. And then yesterday he told me what happened. He got fed up with you, so he left. Do you understand?" Helen couldn't believe what she was hearing. She could feel that John loved her. Was it really possible to play at being in love so skillfully? She heard Anne say something else to her, but she hurried away. Waiting for the train on the platform, Helen looked at the faces of the passers-by, hoping to see the face she loved so dearly among them. She hoped that he would come, explain everything, hug and comfort her. But time passed and he was still gone. "Sweetheart, what's the matter with you? Your face is gone." Her aunt, who was seeing her off, was worried. Of course she understood who her niece was looking for in the crowd. "It's all right. It's all right. Thank you for a wonderful holiday. If it hadn't been for you." Helen stammered and cried, throwing herself around her aunt's neck. A few minutes later, they heard the announcement of an incoming train and hurriedly calmed down. V. He never came. Helen's mind was spinning as the train moved off. So Anne was telling the truth, she concluded. She had time to think about it. Eventually, she realized that everything had happened exactly as Anne had said. How else would she have known about their intimacy the day before? Thinking about the fact that John had told his friends about it with ease, perhaps in great detail, was vile and disgusting. How could he? Resentment was slowly being replaced by anger. Her father's driver was waiting for her on the platform and carefully put her things into the car. At home, she was met by the usual cold silence. It even seemed to Helen that the holiday had been just a dream. A note from her father on the table in her room said she would see him tonight and have some important conversation. Glancing at the portrait of her mother on the shelf, Helen barely held back tears. Suddenly, she realized that she had no one at all to share her worries with. A little later, Mrs. Kate came in. She missed her pupil sincerely, and so did Helen. But there was something about her behavior that was unsettling. The woman cast pitying glances in Helen's direction, and when asked, she was careful to change the subject. Her father came late in the evening when Helen had given up hope of waiting for him and was about to go to bed. He knocked gently on the door of her room. "Are you awake?" he asked, and receiving a negative answer, entered quietly. As Helen sat down in the armchair opposite her daughter, she realized that she missed her father very much. For a moment, she wanted to throw herself into his arms to cuddle like a little girl. But when she assessed the situation, she changed her mind. Her father hadn't seen her in almost 2 months, and not a single muscle in his face betrayed any emotion when they met. Helen's heart clenched as she glanced at her mother's photo. Helen dared to ask, "What did you want to talk to me about?" "Your birthday is coming up," said her father. "I've decided to organize an evening at the Count's restaurant. There will be a lot of important people there. I'll introduce you to a lot of people." "Thank you. But why do I need these people?" The girl timidly objected. "I'd rather celebrate my birthday with my family." "That's out of the question. I've made up my mind. Besides, the preparations for the party are in full swing. You have to outshine everyone. You have time to get ready." My father got up and headed for the door. "Good night," he said and walked out. Helen sat down with her legs tucked up. Her phone vibrated, announcing an incoming message. It was from Aunt Emma. She was worried. Helen smiled. She hadn't received such warmth in a long time. Communicating with her aunt helped to take her mind off her unpleasant thoughts for a while. Saying goodbye, the girl fell into a deep sleep. The new morning greeted her with drizzling rain and cold wind. The sky was covered with bulky gray clouds, giving no chance for a single ray of light to shine through. Helen sighed heavily as she looked out the window. The weather completely reflected the state of her soul. Every minute she thought of John and what he had done. Her heart leapt out of her chest and tears welled up in her eyes at the memory of him. Wrapping herself in a warm blanket, Helen went to her little workshop. There she was finally able to distract herself. Taking in her hands brushes and paints, the girl plunged into painting. Remembering the native features of the face, Helen wrote a portrait of her lover, who broke her heart. Helen did not notice how the time flew by. She woke up only when she heard the sound of the front door opening and her father's loud voice. Helen looked down and was startled to see that her father had clearly been drinking, as evidenced by his awkward movements and his extremely wrinkled and unkempt appearance. "I said no, all right," Mr. Sam Smith shouted. "To sell the factory is to admit bankruptcy. I'll find a way out." Helen tried not to let her father see her like this. It was the first time she'd ever seen him drunk in her life. Something terrible must have happened, Helen thought. She couldn't explain her father's behavior otherwise. Slowly, the girl made her way to the kitchen so as not to run into her father. She began to wait for Mrs. Kate. "Helen, what are you doing here at this hour?" the woman asked with a surprised raised eyebrow as she entered the kitchen. "I need to talk to you." "Did you see the state your father came in?" "Yes, but you shouldn't worry about that. He's been a little overworked lately. I guess he decided to relax," the woman said quickly, not looking at her. "He's drunk out of his mind. I've never seen him like that. What happened? Do you know anything about it? I'm the only one who doesn't know." "I don't know anything, but I assure you it's all right. Now go to bed. It's getting late." Mrs. Kate tried to end the conversation quickly. Helen didn't sleep well that night. The feeling of uneasiness did not leave her. John's face and Anne's haughty face came to mind. That's why she woke up in a bad mood with a sore head. Her father was not present at breakfast, so Helen resolutely went in search of him in his study. She was determined to find out what was going on with him. The door to the study was ajar, and she ventured in without knocking. Mr. Sam Smith sat leaning back in his chair, thinking about something. His eyes were red, proving that he had spent this night without sleep. When he heard his daughter's footsteps, he flinched. "Helen?" He was surprised to see her. "Come in, we need to talk." The girl sat down across from him and waited intently. "You're old enough to understand the things we're going to talk about. I hope for your support." The beginning did not bode well. That's why Helen inwardly tensed up. "My firm is in a critical state. I'm on the verge of bankruptcy. Plus, I'm in massive debt. What to do about it, I don't know yet." Helen sat there completely bewildered. She didn't know what to do next, but one thing was certain: she had to make arrangements for her future. Mr. Sam Smith paused, trying not to look his daughter in the eye. "Your birthday is coming up," he said. "As promised, I'm going to give you a big party." But Papa Helen wanted to reassure her father, for it was the first time in years that he seemed so pathetic and smaller in stature. She wanted to argue that she didn't need this holiday at all, that it wasn't worth spending money on it, which was scarce now. But her father interrupted her sharply. "The matter is settled," he said. "Please listen to me to the end and do not interrupt me. This evening I will introduce you to your future husband." Helen was so shocked that she was speechless for a while. Only after a few minutes did she speak in a quiet voice. "I don't understand how you can make such decisions for me. Who gave you that right? I'm a free man, and there's a man I'm in love with. So your plans aren't going to work out." Helen looked defiantly into her father's eyes, not expecting herself to be so bold. There was no reply, so she got up and went silently to her room. It was the first time she had ever objected to her father, so it made her feel sick to her stomach, and even more so that he had decided to control her fate without her knowledge. When she opened the only photo of her and John in her phone, she cried. For the next few days, she tried not to leave the room unnecessarily. Her father, too, seemed to avoid talking to her. From Mrs. Kate, she learned that he came late from work and almost always drunk. The time on the calendar was approaching the day of her birth. One night before going to bed, Mr. Sam Smith came to make up with his daughter. He spoke so softly and was as affectionate as he had been in his distant childhood when her mother was alive. "All I'm doing is looking after you, darling," he said. "I don't want you to be on the street, because anything could happen. Michael's a good man and he's been wanting to get to know you for a long time, so don't push him away. He'll make a good husband." He said many other things about the mysterious fiancé, marveling at his intelligence and success. They talked till nearly midnight, and Helen promised to think hard. In the morning, when it was barely dawn, she decided to call her aunt for advice. She knew that she would be awake by now, for in the village the time was very early in the morning. "Helen, my girl, how glad I am to hear from you," said Aunt Emma. Her voice brought an involuntary smile to her lips. There was so much I wanted to say and ask, but the lump in my throat prevented me from doing either. "How are you doing? Why are you silent?" Aunt Emma asked warily. I don't know," Helen said and cried. She was rambling, but she recounted the events of the last few days. There was silence on the other end. "Did John ask about me? Had you seen him?" Helen asked timidly. "No, I haven't. They left the village the same day you did," said her aunt. "Please, darling, don't cry. We'll think of something. I'll talk to your father. But you can't marry against your will. It's like the Stone Age." She resented it. After a little talk with her aunt, Helen began to calm down, having received the support of someone close to her. Her aunt promised to call back in a couple of days, assuring her that everything would be all right. She did call back. But this time the conversation didn't bring Helen any comfort. Aunt Emma confusedly advised her niece to take a closer look at Michael and not to be too hasty. Helen was surprised at the change in Aunt Emma's mood, for now everyone was against her. On the eve of the party, her father had brought her a fancy dress in which she was to appear in front of the guests. Helen absolutely did not want to have any fun. Every night she locked herself in her studio. She expressed all her pain and longing in her paintings. Her thoughts took her back to the short time she had spent with her lover. The events of the festive evening unfolded rapidly. She and her father arrived at the restaurant just in time. Many strangers frightened her and made her uncomfortable, but she had to hand it to her father, for he stayed with her almost the whole evening. Looking at the faces of the guests, Helen wondered which one of them was Michael. To her surprise, for almost half of the evening he was not visible among the guests. A pleasant slow tune began to play, and couples began to walk out into the center of the room. Looking round, Helen didn't realize she was alone. Her father had discreetly disappeared somewhere. "Would the birthday girl do me the honor of dancing this slow dance with me?" Helen heard a man's voice behind her. Turning round, she saw a man who, smiling, was staring at her intently. Without waiting for an answer, he drew her imperiously to him and drew her into the crowd of dancing couples. Throughout the dance, the stranger did not utter another word. Helen waited impatiently for the music to end. After all, the man was clearly overstepping his bounds, pressing her so tightly that she could hardly breathe. Finally, the music ended and he disappeared as quickly as he had appeared. Suddenly, a bright light came on, and her father's loud voice came through the microphone. "Dear friends, it is a pleasure to welcome you to the birthday party of my only and favorite daughter." It was clear that Mr. Sam Smith had already knocked over more than one glass of champagne. "In addition, I would like to introduce my future son-in-law and announce the engagement of my daughter and Michael." The guests clapped and some even started whistling. Helen was more excited than ever. Suddenly, the stranger with whom she had been dancing stepped towards her and put his arm around her waist and stood beside her. "Friends," the father continued, "I also want to inform you that Michael is my companion from today. Please love and welcome him." A satisfied smile was on the face of the new bridegroom. He was obviously pleased with himself, and what was happening brought him pleasure. Helen was the only one in the crowd of guests who felt like an extra at the party. She looked at the groom and sighed louder than etiquette allowed. This was not what she had imagined the groom to look like. She had thought he would be about her age or a little older. She even thought she might get used to him and perhaps even like him. After all, it had happened more than once in some people's lives. That was what Mrs. Kate tried to assure her every evening, telling her various stories about people she knew. "Patience is the best medicine, Helen. In the old days, nobody asked anybody about love. The bride and groom's parents would agree, that's all. And over the years, people became a real family," the woman said. "Well, that was in the old days. Now everyone marries for love," Helen objected. "And how can you love a man you've never met? What if we don't like each other?" Helen asked Mrs. Kate. "Well, how can you not like me? You can't find a beauty like that anywhere." But little by little, in the course of such discussions, Helen herself began to set herself up for a favorable outcome. "After all, if he disgusts me, it's not by force that my father will force me to marry," thought the girl. And now, standing near her fiancé, who was 10 or perhaps 15 years older than she was, Helen found herself at a complete loss. Someone was coming up with congratulations, but she heard nothing at all. John's face came back into her imagination, so dear and beloved. And that groom was standing there smiling arrogantly, clasping her as if she were his property. She got out of his embrace and walked away from the crowd. Helen sat on the sofa in the lobby, letting the tears flow freely down her cheeks. Making sure no one was around, she didn't hold back her emotions. Tears of joy? Hearing a woman's voice, Helen turned around. Standing next to her was a pretty slim brunette with a glass of champagne. "I'm sorry, I'm Helen. I don't know what to say," she said, addressing the stranger. "It's okay, don't apologize," she said. "My name is Caroline." She extended her hand for a handshake and smiled. "Let me offer you a glass of champagne in honor of our acquaintance." Helen nodded. "Why not? A little relaxation and distraction wouldn't be a bad idea right now." At a table in the far corner of the room, the girls chatted casually. "You're a good girl," Caroline said. "Honestly, I thought you were arrogant, considering who your father is." Helen just smiled back, unable to find anything to say. "And my fiancé dumped me today," Caroline said with a sigh. "Can you imagine he just said that it was over between us, and that he was going to marry someone else? How could he do that? You're so beautiful." Helen tried to console her. "I guess money is everything in this life. No one needs love anymore," Caroline said sadly. "But I believe in love, and so do you. He'll regret what he did, and he'll come back." Helen had no sooner finished than she noticed Mr. Sam Smith and Michael approaching their table. "What are you doing here?" he asked Caroline rudely. "Just congratulating the bride." "Don't worry, I was just leaving," she replied, standing up and heading for the exit. "What right do you have to send my guests away?" Helen asked her father sternly. "She wasn't on the guest list," he replied. "Don't worry, dear, I'm just keeping you from unnecessary contact," Mr. Michael added with a strained smile that looked more like a grin. "Let me decide for myself what socializing I want and what I don't want," Helen objected rudely. Apologizing, she followed Caroline, but to her dismay, the girl had already left the restaurant. Helen spent the rest of the evening trying to avoid everyone, including her own father. She was anxious to get home as soon as possible to get her thoughts together. When the evening was finally over, Helen was relieved when she went into her room and sat down on her bed, completely exhausted. There was no point in talking to her father tonight, but tomorrow the conversation was bound to happen. That was what Helen decided as she fell asleep. Waking up, and without waiting for breakfast, the girl headed for her father's study. He was already there. "We need to talk," Helen began abruptly. Her father looked at his daughter in bewilderment. This was a tone she had never used with him before. "I don't want to marry Mr. Michael. Please let him know that," she said. "The matter of your marriage is settled and non-negotiable," said her father again. "Michael is a very promising young man. You'll get on well with him." "Young? He's at least 10 years older than I am," Helen objected. "Besides, I don't like him at all. Arrogant and presumptuous. I don't want to marry him, Papa." "He couldn't help it," he shouted. "Enough. I've already told you that my finances are bad and we might end up on the street," Dad said. "So I'm concerned about your future." "It's a pity, Dad, that for the first time in my life I'll have to go against your will," Helen said quietly. "I want to love and be loved too. Have you forgotten how happy it is to live with someone you love?" She knew she had touched a sore subject. Her father was still suffering from the loss of his wife and tried not to talk about such topics. Suddenly, he sank into a chair, lowered his head, and sobbed. Helen was shocked by what was happening and did not know how to behave. "I always loved your mother. I worshipped her," he said through his sobs. "And believe me, I haven't forgotten what happiness is like. After losing her, I concentrated on my work, trying to distract myself from the pain and emptiness that had settled in my heart. I put everything on the line for my success. Things have been going from bad to worse lately. My competitors have been investigating me. I've had to suspend production. Creditors are calling in debts, and I can't pay them. Michael offered to work with me and help me financially. He has a lot of connections in all the agencies, and in return he wanted to be my son-in-law." Her father looked her straight in the eye. "Please, my daughter, agree," he pleaded. "Don't break your old man's heart. I won't survive the loss of the firm." Helen silently walked out of the office. There were no tears. Thoughts were jumbled in her head. She went up to the studio and began to paint furiously, without stopping for a moment. She didn't come out until the next morning. A worried Mrs. Kate was waiting for her. "Helen, what's the matter?" she asked. "I'm all right," she replied dryly. "Tell my father that I agree. Tell him to start preparing for the wedding." As the door closed behind Mrs. Kate, Helen spoke aloud, looking at her mother's picture. "I'll do what he wants for you, Mum. I don't want him to suffer for using me as a bargaining chip. Let that be on his conscience." From that day on, Helen became completely indifferent to everything that happened next. The days passed in the hustle and bustle of the wedding. The endless fitting of the wedding dress and other preparations were of no interest to Helen. She saw Michael twice more when he came to see her father, and then only in passing. He seemed to have no tenderness or interest in the bride. On the day of the wedding, Helen stood in her gorgeous wedding dress, trying to fight back tears. A multitude of guests took turns saying their congratulations and wishing happiness and love to the young ones. The bride thought about her own thoughts and listened to almost nothing. Occurring periodically, nausea and dizziness did not give rest. The fact is that a fortnight before the planned celebration, Helen learned that she was pregnant. This news at first caused a wild horror, and then she realized that in this way she would find the meaning of life, and the baby is her salvation from loneliness. That the father of the child, John, there was no doubt, as Helen was no one else Helen was close to. This fact both pleased and frightened her. On the one hand, the child would be a part of the man she loved. Helen did not want to have children from her unloved husband. But how would Michael feel about it? After all, he would surely find out. Helen tried not to think about that for now. She was worried about Aunt Emma's absence at the party. She was the person she most wanted to see. But neither her father nor Mrs. Kate could explain clearly why Auntie was not on the guest list. Her phone was silent in all Helen's attempts to reach her. The groom socialized more with the guests than with the bride. Only occasionally, under the shouts of bitter, he roughly grabbed her for a kiss. When the celebration was over, she had to get home alone. Of course, a car with a driver was waiting for her near the restaurant. It could not be otherwise, given the financial situation of the newly married husband. Only he, unfortunately, got so drunk at the end of the evening that he fell asleep on the sofa in the restaurant lobby. Helen couldn't help but feel relieved that she would have to spend the night alone. But to her surprise, the next day Michael did not show any interest in her. On the contrary, he deliberately went to bed in another room, dropping a greeting as he went. He made no further conversation with her. Helen didn't know how she should react to this behavior. On the one hand, she didn't want to be intimate with her husband, but on the other hand, she wondered why he was trying so hard to make her his wife when now it was as if he didn't notice, or even ignored her. There were more questions than answers. So after a few days of tense silence, Helen decided to talk to her husband, which she later regretted. Waking up before Michael, she hurried to the kitchen and made him coffee. After making a simple breakfast for herself, she poured tea and waited for her husband. Michael came downstairs and caught Helen's questioning look. "You didn't have to strain yourself," he said. "I never have breakfast at home." Having said that, he took the cup with the coffee prepared for him and defiantly poured it into the sink. "What's going on? Will you bother to explain why you're avoiding me?" "I don't understand anything." Helen tried to speak calmly, so as not to give away her excitement. "Don't fill your pretty head with unnecessary things," dear Michael said playfully. "And don't have any illusions about my great love. You are only a good investment in my capital." Having said that, the man turned round and left. Helen felt as if she were chained to the chair. She had thought that if she didn't fall in love, she could surely be a good friend to her husband. But now? For the next few days, Helen hardly left her room. The constant nausea and bouts of dizziness were unrelenting, and every bite she ate was asking to go out. So she tried to lie down more, occasionally sending maids for tea or milk. She had not yet seen a doctor, but she was determined to do so when she felt better. But everything was decided by chance. One evening, without waiting for the maid to come, she decided to go down to the kitchen for tea. Helen felt sick and fainted before she reached the dining room. The maid came running to the noise, followed by Michael, who had recently returned from work. Helen woke up in her room. Nearby were Michael and a man in a white coat. "You're awake, my dear," the doctor said affectionately. "How long has it been with you?" "Not very long," Helen answered reluctantly and turned away. "Well, it's all clear. Congratulations, Mr. Smith. Your wife will soon give you an heir," the doctor said cheerfully. "That's very interesting," Michael said thoughtfully. "Thank you, doctor. I think you should go now. I'd like to be alone with my wife." he said to the doctor in a tone that did not tolerate objections. A moment later, they were alone. Helen held her breath, waiting for accusations and possibly a divorce. "Get some rest. I won't bother you," Michael said. "Tomorrow you'll go with the driver and register at the antenatal clinic. And also don't forget that you need to eat a full meal and be outdoors more often." And for the first time kissed his wife on the cheek. Michael went out. Helen's thoughts were jumbled in her head. Michael's actions did not fit with their last conversation. The fact that the child was not his was clear to everyone, but he didn't show it. And even when the doctor left, he didn't change his tactics. The next day, Helen went to the doctor to register her pregnancy. The term turned out to be almost 3 months, exactly how long it had been since she had last seen John. The girl tried to chase away the thoughts of him, because they necessarily caused tears and worries. And she couldn't be nervous now. Having plunged headlong into the expectation of the baby, Helen almost tried not to pay attention to the strange behavior of her husband. And there were strange behaviors. Now he controlled her every move. She couldn't go anywhere without her driver. It was only when she went to her father's house that she was able to be away from the eyes that were always watching her. Helen lacked communication, and so, finding one day in the pocket of her coat a note with Caroline's phone number, the girl was overjoyed and immediately dialed the number. "Caroline, it's Helen. Remember at my birthday party?" "Of course I remember," Caroline answered quickly. "How are you? Would you like to meet?" "I'd love to," Helen replied. The girls agreed to meet in the park in the evening. The meeting went beautifully. The girls chatted a lot about everything. It even seemed to Helen that they had known each other for years. "So how do you like marriage?" Caroline asked timidly. Sighing heavily, Helen replied, "I don't know. We're strangers, and we don't talk much. Only about the pregnancy. But I can't help it. I promised my father." Helen felt tears come to her eyes. "Didn't you marry for love?" "Any girl would be happy to be Michael's wife," Caroline said. "Maybe, but not me. The day I got engaged, I saw him for the first time. And my father had already made up his mind for me. And even though my heart belongs to someone else, I can't betray my father. It's important to him. And he's the only family I have," Helen said sadly. Caroline was silent. For the rest of the walk, she was very thoughtful and taciturn. But saying goodbye, the girls agreed to meet again in a couple of days. The next morning, Helen had an unpleasant conversation with her husband. "Who did you see yesterday?" he asked as soon as Helen came down to breakfast. "A friend. What does it matter? Or am I not allowed to do that anymore?" Helen looked into Michael's eyes. His hard stare made her uncomfortable. "Here's the deal. I forbid you to see her. Is that clear?" he asked in a raised tone. "What right do you have to control my life?" Helen shouted, unable to hold back her tears. "I'm not your property, Michael." "You're wrong, darling. And soon you will be convinced of it." Her husband smiled haughtily, reminiscent of a grin. Helen silently stood up and went to her room, wiping her tears. The following evening, she decided to have a serious talk with her father. This couldn't go on any longer. Entering her father's study, she began at once about the main thing. "Father, I can't go on like this. I want a divorce." Hearing her words, her father turned very pale. "Are you crazy, daughter? How could you think such a thing?" "Imagine I could. I can't live with Michael any longer, so I'm asking you to settle your business matters, after which I'll file for divorce." It took a lot of courage and effort for Helen to talk to her father like that. Deep down, she felt insanely sorry for him, but no less sorry for herself. "All right," replied her father at last. "But I need a few months to sort things out because your husband has half the shares in my firm. Be patient for a while, and then do what you want." Father waved his hand and walked out silently. He never came down for dinner. In vain they waited for him with Mrs. Kate. "Oh dear, I don't like this," said the woman, sharing her worries. "Mr. Sam Smith has been drinking a lot lately, smoking a lot, and not sleeping much. He must be in a bad way." "That's odd. He told me that things had improved since the wedding," Helen thought. The next day, Helen phoned Caroline to arrange a meeting, but she refused, citing illness. Her voice trembled. Helen was alarmed by this, so she decided to visit her friend, taking all precautions. After all, it was absolutely impossible for her to be ill right now. The driver took her to her father's house, and from there, coming out through another entrance, Helen took a taxi to her friend's house. The appearance of the friend struck Helen. Who did this? She pointed to the huge bruise and bruising on Caroline's cheek. It doesn't matter. You don't know him anyway. Caroline brushed it off and went to put the kettle on, making it clear that she didn't want to discuss the subject. Helen didn't press her friend. When she wants to, she'll tell you, she thought. There were men's things in the flat, although Caroline had said she lived alone. After chatting for a while, Helen left her friend and drove home. She couldn't be late, or Michael would suspect her of lying. She was frankly afraid of him lately. Of course, he hadn't done anything bad to her yet, but sometimes he looked at her like that, or spoke in a tone that sent shivers down her spine. So Helen decided not to make her husband angry. In the evening, Michael said that one day his cousin and his fiancée were coming to visit them. "Please prepare everything for their arrival," he said sternly. "Everything must be dignified. I hope I am understood." Helen nodded in response. Selecting an outfit to meet the guests, Helen wore a soft blue dress in the color of her eyes, a little loose cut, although it was hard not to notice the belly, which was growing every day. On Helen's orders, the servants had prepared a festive dinner of poultry and numerous appetizers. As Helen went down to the table, she heard the sound of voices coming from the living room. Apparently, Michael had arrived at the same time as the guests, because his voice was the clearest. For a moment, Helen froze. One of the voices sounded very familiar to her. Her heart pounded frantically. Her legs became cotton woolly. The girl could not move from her seat. "Meet my dear brother." "My wife Helen," Michael introduced her. John stood in front of her, amazed as much as she was, and extended his hand. "Nice to meet you, John," he said. Behind him stood Anne, smiling wryly. For a moment, Helen thought she was going to faint. "Are you all right? You don't look well." Noticing the pallor on her face, John asked. "Don't worry, brother. It's just that my wife is pregnant, and I'm going to have an heir soon," Michael laughed. "Congratulations," John replied quietly. "Well, let's go to the table," he said. John found himself across from Helen at the table and kept his eyes on her. Anne was angry and tried to distract her fiancé. "I'm sorry, Michael, that we couldn't come to your wedding. John is literally obsessed with his studies. And after he was invited to work at the cardiac center, I don't see him at home." Anne gave John a defiant hug, glancing defiantly at the pale Helen. "I hope you'll come to our wedding." "And how soon will it be?" Michael asked. "We haven't decided anything yet, so it's too early to talk about it," John cut in. Anne was silent. It was obvious that she was hurt by the words. When it was time for the hot meal, Michael suddenly shouted, "Well, who do you think will eat this rubbish?" He turned to his wife, pointing at the roast turkey. "I thought everyone would like it," Helen replied, confused. "Next time, before you think with your chicken brain, consult your husband." Michael couldn't stop himself. Apparently, the strong drinks were doing their job. "I don't see what the problem is. I have a great respect for turkey." John stood up for Helen. "Don't," she whispered, looking at him. Tears glistened in her eyes. She left the table and walked quickly to her room. "Why do you treat your wife like that, and even a pregnant wife? Hasn't time changed you at all?" John asked. "She deserved it. Besides, I don't need counselors," Michael replied gruffly. "I agree with Michael. Why serve something your husband doesn't like?" Anne interjected. "Shut up. You're so pleased you spoke your mind today." John looked at Anne with annoyance. "All right, spit it out. Why did you come here?" "I'm guessing it wasn't out of love for your cousin," Michael asked, and the men went out onto the veranda to continue their conversation in private. Helen was crying hard in her room. Her feelings were overwhelming her, and now they were bursting out. She realized that she still loved John. That made the pain seem even worse. That evening, John and Anne stayed the night. Helen realized this when she caught John having a cup of coffee in the kitchen in the early hours of the morning. "Hi, will you join us?" John asked. "No, thanks. I think you should wait for your fiancé." "I'll have tea in my room," Helen replied. "Your room? Are you and Michael in separate rooms?" "I'm sorry, but I don't think that's any of your business," Helen sneered, and taking the cup of tea she had prepared, was about to turn round and leave when she felt John grab her arm. "I think we need to talk." Helen stared silently into his eyes, in which she was sinking by the minute. She realized that the conversation was inevitable, but she tried to delay it. "What is there to talk about? How you bet your friends that you could easily get me into bed? Or maybe you want to tell me how long you laughed at me after it happened?" Helen's voice trembled, tears welling up in her eyes. "What argument? What nonsense? I was shocked when you left without even saying goodbye. I ran to your aunt, but she asked me to leave you alone. I begged her for your address, but she was adamant. I tried to find you, but I realized I didn't even know your surname." John stopped talking. "I don't believe you," Helen sighed. "Especially now it doesn't matter. You don't love him now, and you're unhappily married. It doesn't concern you. You made your choice back then." Helen pulled her hand from his and ran upstairs. Her temples throbbed, her heart was pounding so hard that it seemed it would burst out of her chest. The girl dialed Caroline's number and told her everything. "What do you think you're going to do?" she asked her friend. "I don't know," Helen sobbed. "I don't know anything. Maybe you should tell him he's having your baby." Caroline had been privy to the secret for a long time lately. She was the only person Helen could share it with. The girl, sincerely sympathized with her friend, was aware of the rather strange relationship between her and her husband. He had a wedding coming up. Why should he know that? "Perhaps Anne will soon give him her children," Helen replied sadly. "Don't worry, we'll think of something. Besides, your father has promised to sort things out and authorize the divorce. The most important thing is to stop being nervous in your condition. It's dangerous for the baby." Talking to her friend calmed Helen down a little. That day she decided not to go downstairs. And the next day there were no more guests. Time passed, but the father could not yet sort things out. The pregnancy was coming to its logical conclusion, so Helen was very worried. She never saw John again, although he had managed to give her his card with his contacts through the maid. Michael looked at her as if she was nothing, and sometimes snapped at her, picking on every little thing. On the due date, Helen gave birth to a beautiful baby girl and named her Mary after her mother. When she looked at her, she gasped. The baby was an exact copy of her father, even the mole on her left cheek inherited from him. She was met from the maternity hospital by a driver sent by her husband and Mrs. Kate and Caroline. On the first evening at home there was a scandal. Michael came home from work drunk and immediately blamed his wife. "How worthless you are. You can't even give birth to a son. I wanted a son, an heir." "And what's this?" He pointed to the cradle where the baby was sleeping quietly. "What are you talking about, Michael? You knew it wasn't your child from the start, but you pretended it wasn't. What kind of heir are you talking about?" "Yeah, I can't have kids, okay? And I was counting on this baby. He was born in wedlock, which means no one would question our parentage. A girl wasn't part of my plan," he shouted. "You don't have to worry. We'll be going home soon, and you won't have to endure our presence," Helen replied as calmly as she could. Michael laughed and pushed Helen against the wall. "You're wrong," he whispered. "You have nowhere to go back to. Everything your father has is signed over to me. I've got him on a tight leash. He won't say a word against me. So unless you want me to throw him out on the street in his trousers and you and your bastard, I suggest you think twice." "What's all this for?" she asked, barely breathing. "In time you'll find out. Be patient, my dear. But I'm warning you. Don't do anything stupid. It could hurt Daddy, or Nanny, or our little girl." Michael laughed wildly. The baby cried. Helen rushed to comfort the baby. She was stunned. She realized that Michael was crazy. And now she was even more afraid of him. She had only been able to call her father once. She realized from the conversation she had had with him that he would not be supportive. He was clearly not well. As usual, he asked her to be patient a little longer. On the occasion of the baby's birth, Michael organized a party. All his friends were invited, and John and Anne. The party was taking place in the living room on the ground floor, so Helen preferred not to go down to the guests, for fear of leaving the baby alone for even a minute. Suddenly there was a knock at the door. It was John. "May I come in?" he asked timidly. Helen nodded silently. John walked over to the cot and looked at the baby girl. "She's so cute. I've never seen such pretty babies," he smiled. Helen's heart sank as she watched the tenderness with which John looked at his daughter. "I wish he hadn't noticed the resemblance," Helen repeated to herself. The girl cried, and she immediately picked her up in her arms. "Motherhood suits you." "You're even more beautiful now," John said affectionately. Helen could hardly keep herself from throwing herself at his neck and telling him how she felt and who he was to her daughter. But suddenly, almost at the door, Anne's voice sounded. "You have to go now," Anne said sadly. "I hope I'll see you again." "At least I'd like to," John said quietly and went out. A fortnight later, the little girl was ill with a fever. There were no other symptoms. The girl screamed all the time. The antipyretics were almost ineffective. "Could you call a doctor, please?" Helen asked. "You don't need to bother your husband. It's just a cold," Michael assured her. "Please, the baby's not well." You can see that she begged. "All right. The doctor will be here tomorrow," Michael replied indifferently. All evening the girl was fussy. By nightfall, Helen realized that it was more serious than she had thought. The girl's lips had turned blue, and the attacks of suffocation caused wild horror to her mother. Not knowing what to do, Helen dialed John's number on her business card. "John, please help. My daughter is dying," Helen shouted into the phone. "I'll come over right now and call an ambulance." "Hurry, please." Helen couldn't find a place to go as she hastily gathered the necessary things for herself and the baby. She rushed downstairs with her daughter in her arms to wait for the ambulance. John arrived at the same time as the ambulance, having ordered them to take the girl to the cardiac center where he worked. Michael didn't come out to the noise, apparently sleeping very soundly after taking another drink. "What's wrong with the baby?" she asked John when he and the professor came out of the room. "The situation is complicated. The girl has a heart defect." "Did any of your relatives have a similar condition?" asked the professor. "Yes, my mom," Helen answered with trembling lips. "The girl needs an urgent operation. Do you give your consent?" "Yes, of course." "Then we need to sign the necessary documents and start the preparations," said the professor. At that moment, the phone in Helen's pocket rang. "How dare you leave with the child without my knowledge?" shouted into the receiver husband. "My daughter needs help, and I, as a mother, will do everything I can to help her. We're not coming home to you again. I'll file for divorce myself." Helen said what she'd been wanting to say for a long time. "What did you say? Divorce? There's one thing you haven't considered, dear. I'm the father of the baby, and with my connections, I could easily take her away from you." "You wouldn't do that." "You're wrong. That's why it's in your best interest to come back. Otherwise, you'll see," Michael said and disconnected. Clutching the phone, Helen felt a ringing in her ears and her eyes went dark. John picked up the fainting woman and carried her to his office. When Helen woke up, she smelled the pungent odor of ammonia. "I really need your help." In a pleading tone, she began the conversation. John nodded silently. "We need to register the car under someone else's name and surname. Otherwise, he'll find us," Helen said. John didn't ask any more questions, but within an hour, she had the child's card with the changed personal data. Helen stayed close to her daughter the whole time the operation was being prepared. She only left to wash or eat. John was always there, too. He knew that Michael was looking for his wife all over the city, but did not tell Helen. The most important thing now was the outcome of the operation. The girl was operated on by one of the best cardiologists in the city. John assisted. Those few hours that Annie was in the operating theater seemed to Helen an eternity. And only when John said that the worst was over and the operation was successful, Helen was able to breathe out. She cried, throwing herself into John's arms. "Annie is my daughter, isn't she?" he asked Helen, gently stroking her hair. She nodded, and he pulled her even tighter. Later, sitting in the hospital cafe, the young people were drinking coffee and listening to the radio. Suddenly, the music was interrupted by an urgent news bulletin. It was reporting a major fire in one of the houses in an upscale neighborhood in the city. Helen was horrified to hear her father's address. He had died in the fire, suffocated and unable to escape. Mrs. Kate was badly injured and was in hospital. Helen rushed to her. The woman said that it was probably arson, for the doors of the house were propped up from the outside. Because of this, they could not get out. She also told of a letter she had kept for Helen. "It was from your auntie. I opened it, don't swear, but it must have been necessary, because it was burnt. And I read it your aunt had been seriously ill lately, and her soul was longing to see you. She rang many times. Only Mr. Sam Smith forbade her to see you. Said she shouldn't mess with her head. Well, she sent me a letter before she died. No one but me ever saw it. She bequeathed the house in the village to you. She asked you not to leave it, and at the end she wrote, 'I hope you will find true happiness at your source,' said Mrs. Kate, and closed her eyes." Helen cried quietly. Suddenly, she saw through the window Michael's car in the car park. The girl rushed down the corridor, looking for an emergency exit, because John was waiting for her in the car. "Hurry, he found me," Helen shouted, and the car whistled to a stop. In the mirror, she could see Michael's Jeep following them. "God, he won't spare us now." "John, please," she pleaded. Michael caught up with them. One more spurt, and he could have blocked their path. But as fate would have it, a logging truck was in the oncoming lane and Michael's car slammed into it at full speed. John and Helen were sitting in the waiting room. "He wants to see you," the nurse announced. Helen entered the room where Michael was lying. He looked pathetic now. There were tubes literally everywhere, but he was conscious. "My only regret is that I didn't finish what I started," he whispered. "Why do you hate me so much? What have I done to you? You are his daughter and you should have suffered, just as I did when, before you were born, he met my mother. I was a little boy then. He tamed me, and I loved him. And so did Mum. Then he met your mum and easily threw us out of his life. Mum couldn't take it and started drinking. I was raised by relatives. All the while I was plotting my revenge and following his life. You were born into wealth, you had everything, money, loving parents. I had nothing, nothing at all, you know." Michael looked at Helen with contempt. "So I set out to succeed, to destroy your family. And I almost succeeded." Helen did not listen anymore, silently left the room. Michael survived, but became an invalid, confined to a wheelchair. He was cared for by Caroline, Helen's friend. As it turned out, Caroline had long been in love with Michael and had even dated him. At first, she was terribly jealous of Helen, but after getting to know her better, she became warm to her and tried to talk Michael out of his devious plans. A month later, Helen and John were taking their daughter home from the hospital. They were on their way to their new home, the village, the one that had bound their lives together forever. They were happy to be back to their roots. Ex-fiancé and best friend decided to humiliate Emma by inviting her to their wedding and seeing MP4. The slender girl whirled into the hospitably opened doors. Missing the greeting, the guest declared to the hostess, who by the spectacular figure was not inferior to Emma, "Get dressed quickly. The screening starts in half an hour, and we have to get there." "Hey, Caroline, what are you doing? What screening? Where are we going?" The guest, almost jumping with impatience, gestured vigorously, as if trying to give her friend the necessary acceleration, and snidely asked again, "What viewing? Couldn't you ask anything cleverer?" "Well, not the cookery one, the dance one, of course. Come on, Wall Street, we're running out of time. You seem a little slow today, and you don't look very fresh. All the same, why don't you put on a quick face mask or something?" The hostess sighed and tried to explain her tiredness to the energetic Caroline and politely declined to participate in the viewing. "I'm sorry, I'd rather rest at home, to be honest. Grandma's not feeling well. Her blood pressure in the morning was off the charts in my memory. I even had to call an ambulance. Just the other day, the general practitioner came round and wrote a lot of tests to be taken tomorrow. I'm going to call an on-site lab for Granny so I don't have to go to the clinic. So Caroline, I wish you good luck, and I'll keep my fingers crossed for you. The guest twisted at her temple, showing what she thought of her interlocutor. What are you trying to do, Emma? Set me up. I sent a video of our doubles performance to the preliminaries. After I got the message that I liked the dance, I officially applied for the duet section. A duet is two people. If I suddenly appear on stage alone, my number the jury will not look at. Urgently looking for a partner is also a dubious endeavor. Emma didn't hold back her indignation and asked her friend directly. Shouldn't you have asked me if I wanted to perform and fight with competitors for something unknown? Seeing that Emma wasn't giving in to flattery, Caroline changed her tone to a pleading one. I'm begging you, Emma. Please, 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 please. It's not like I ask you for anything that often. You're our signature program. Even if I wake you up in the middle of the night, you'll do it perfectly. You and I are a perfect team. I can't find such a talented partner, even if I search for several years. Especially since we have a little over 2 hours before the screening. An older woman came out to the voices in the corridor and said hello to the guest. Caroline, good afternoon. Hello, Mrs. Isabella. Emma perked up. Grandma, what's wrong? Are you not feeling well? The woman shook her head. I'm fine, Emma. You've heard, haven't you? The doctor said you should move around a bit if your blood pressure is more or less within normal limits. I just measured it. It's 130/95. If it goes down any further, I could go into space. I'll go to the kitchen and make some tea. The guest decided to make a move on her friend's grandmother. Mrs. Isabella, how are you feeling? Maybe I can run and get some medicine while Emma is getting ready? The woman smiled. You were a foxy little fox, and you're still a foxy little fox. There's no need to run out for medicine. I've got everything I need. I'm sorry, girls, but I accidentally heard bits of your conversation, even though I wasn't listening. So why don't you tell me where you need to get Emma all of a sudden? Caroline's voice sounded pitiful, almost tearful. To watch the dance competition, Miss Isabella. It's practically a matter of life and death for me. Emma refuses. The woman looked carefully at Caroline, who folded her hands in a pleading gesture, shifted her gaze to her granddaughter, and looked into her eyes and asked, Sweetheart, you should probably get some rest, shouldn't you? I've tortured you with my caprices. So girls, let's go and have tea. Surely this is not the last contest that will be held. Caroline knew perfectly well that it was useless to argue with her friend's grandmother. The girl obediently threw off her shoes and headed to the bathroom to wash her hands with fragrant scented soap. She couldn't stop thinking of arguments that would help her to make her friend keep her company at the contest. Sitting down at her long-established seat at the table in her best friend's house, Caroline turned to her grandmother again. Mrs. Isabella, you see, this contest is not the most ordinary or simple. Winning it will be a chance to completely change a life. You see, even though it's a regional competition, the winners get a trip to the capital. Frankly speaking, I understand that at the qualifying stage you have to stand out so much to distinguish yourself from the crowd of talents. And then there will be training, and during it you will be able to polish your movements almost to perfection. The main thing for me is to get through the first round, but without Emma, it will be much more problematic. Especially since I applied for a duet. I'm sorry I didn't consult her. That's my mistake, I admit. But it was in good faith. Emma objected, but not in a mean-spirited way. You could have asked my opinion on the phone. We're in touch all the time, and you haven't even hinted at it once. Feeling that her friend was not angry, grumbling only because she was a little hurt by her arbitrary decision to participate in the contest, Caroline continued her persuasion. Mrs. Isabella, you must understand that Emma has nothing to lose by going to this screening for fun. If she doesn't like the idea, if she doesn't want to compete, then she doesn't have to do it anymore. I promise that after successfully passing the qualifying round, I will not insist on anything. I'll swear on anything. I just want to get through the auditions. Please, Mrs. Isabella. Let Emma come with me. Look how much better she looks already. She's got that tea blush on her cheeks, hasn't she? Help me out." The girl turned to her friend. Caroline was a persistent persuader. Emma trembled and looked at her grandmother and asked, "Are you actually feeling well, or are you just trying to make me feel better?" The woman smiled. "I'm actually fine. Go on, my soul. Have fun," Mrs. Isabella said. Caroline clapped her hands and ran up to hug her friend's grandmother. "Thank you, Mrs. Isabella. You are awesome. The coolest grandma in the world, and a sly vixen." The woman smiled, and while her granddaughter gathered herself, began to ask her guest about the well-being of her family. Soon Emma announced to her friend that she was ready, and the girls headed to the casting. They decided not to spend money on a taxi. On the way to the place of the contest, Emma involuntarily thought that, however it was, it could not be otherwise. After all, how could she refuse her best friend, with whom they share the joys and problems in half for more than half of their lives? The girls met at a children's sports camp. They were in different squads and almost did not communicate, but having gone through a curious situation, they became best friends. It was a passion for dancing that first became a reason for heightened competition, and later brought them closer due to a similar level of wealth. The parents of the girls were about the same level and could afford to pay for an expensive hobby. Emma and Caroline studied at prestigious choreography studios in the city, but in different neighborhoods, and went to training with sincere pleasure. During the summer holidays, both girls missed their favorite activity. So when a talent contest was announced in the camp, they decided to take part. Of course, each of them prepared to perform a dance number. The camp management provided a place for everyone to practice, which, however, was not very many. The opening time of the detached one-story building with a hall and a stage was limited, so that willy-nilly the participants knew quite well what their opponents would emphasize. It wasn't to say that Caroline's training at her choreography studio was shoddy, but she was jealous that Emma was not as good at some of the elements as she was at others. Besides, her rival practiced with complete dedication. Even outside of rehearsals, Emma was immersed in her thoughts. She walked along the paths for a long time, then stopped, wrote something in a small notebook, and went on. No matter how hard Caroline tried, she couldn't see what Emma was writing down. The day of the contest came quickly. There was literally no empty space in the hall. After all, let's face it, there wasn't a lot of entertainment in the camp. According to the draw, Emma had to perform right after the magician, who opened the talent parade. Going on stage, the girl brilliantly began her performance to a song familiar to everyone. However, as soon as the first lines of the second verse were heard from the speakers, the music stopped and silence hung in the hall. Only the girl on the stage behaved as if nothing had happened and continued her dance. She, as well as before, managed to look into the hall so that it seemed that she looked into the soul of each spectator. Emma's lips moved slightly. Apparently, she was still humming the song softly, helping herself not to get lost in the dance. It was fantastically beautiful. The silence was suddenly broken by a lone voice coming from somewhere in the back rows, blasting the popular lines out loud. The unknown soloist was then joined by other audience members. Soon almost the entire auditorium, including not only teenagers but also a good portion of the staff, picked up the familiar lines. One of the contestants, who was standing with a guitar backstage waiting for his entrance, began to strum the melody on the instrument. As Emma performed, she made several deep curtsies to each side of the auditorium, as if there were nobles there, as well as to her unexpected musical accompaniment backstage. Smiling, she sent air kisses to everyone, at which point the applause started. As a result, the first prize was awarded to Emma. The silver prize winner was a young man who played the guitar perfectly and won many hearts. Third place honors went to Caroline. She didn't seem upset. She found the strength to congratulate those who had beaten her, thanking the judges in the audience. That night, after lights out, Caroline went to Emma's cabin and called her in to talk. The winner did not refuse. At Caroline's suggestion, they went to the dining room so that, she said, they could not be overheard by curious neighbors, and sat down on a bench. The silence lengthened and Emma asked, "Well, what did you want? Speak quickly, because I'm tired and I'm falling off my feet." "Anyway, I just wanted to admire your performance. You were great, you were great. You handled an unusual situation very well. Didn't get confused and danced everything without a hitch." Emma was pleased to hear the praise from a peer who knew about dancing, and she confessed, "In general, it's not really my merit. Our coach once told us that at any level of competition you have to be ready for anything." She gave an example of how once at the World Figure Skating Championships in the early 70s, one of the pairs competing for the Soviet Union found itself in a terrible situation. The musical accompaniment during the program simply switched off. However, the Soviet skaters continued to perform the elements as if nothing had happened. The secret was that they were practicing differently at the insistence of their coach. The whole pattern of the dance, or I don't remember exactly how they call the sequence of elements, was subordinated to a strict rhythm, calculated by seconds. And the absence of music in the middle of the performance was not a disaster. Of course, it was much more difficult for them than for me today. Can you imagine the difference in the scale of the competition? Plus, no one was singing along. I had that inspirational example in mind today too, and the incredible support from the audience was palpable. Caroline was thrilled. Originally, when she challenged her rival to a meeting, she just wanted to know her secret. Now she decided to become her friend. Emma accepted the offer to communicate. They exchanged what they knew, and even came up with a few dance routines to perform at the Parents' Day. The girls came up with a little number and drew a flurry of applause. Upon returning to town, the girlfriends continued to socialize. Caroline even went to the studio where Emma trained. As they grew up, slim, young, perfectly dancing beauties invariably attracted attention at discos. The girls together entered the Institute of Culture and managed to reach the equator, when the happy, quiet life of Emma collapsed overnight. Her parents were killed in the family car. As soon as they had driven a little away from the car park at the shopping center, the car flew into the air. The doctors were powerless to do anything. The girl was saved only by the fact that she was not feeling very well that day and stayed at home, not going shopping with her parents. She lay on the sofa under a warm woolen plaid and drank tea with lemon, trying to overcome the malaise as soon as possible. When Emma saw her grandmother opening the door of her dead daughter's flat with her own key, she realized that something irreparable had happened. Mrs. Isabella hugged her granddaughter and whispered the bitter news in her ear. The girl could not find a place for herself. It seemed to her that if she had gone with her parents, she would have noticed something wrong and prevented the death of her loved ones. She tried not to upset her grandmother, but at times tears dripped from her eyes when she was reminded of her parents. During that terrible period, Caroline became a real support for Emma. She literally moved into Mrs. Isabella's flat, where Emma's friend had moved after the tragedy, and kept her grief at bay. She lived there, almost forcibly took her to the institute, forced at least something to eat. To the surprise of many neighbors and vain gossipers, the perpetrator involved in the massacre of Emma's parents managed to detain. And the main merit belonged not to the law enforcement agencies, which, as if someone sent a directive not to be too active in the search for the criminal, the grandmother spared no expense to punish not only the murderer, but also the customer of the massacre of the only adored daughter and son-in-law, whom she, contrary to popular belief, respected and loved. Mrs. Isabella sold her jewelry and carefully shielded her granddaughter from the details of the investigation and court proceedings. She seriously feared for Emma, for her psychological state, even 6 months after the tragedy, was deplorable. As soon as the girl approached the house where the flat where she lived with her parents was located, she would become hysterical. Emma couldn't forgive herself for staying alive. To return to the place where she had once been happy, the girl refused flatly. Mrs. Isabella didn't insist. It was not easy for her, and alone she would probably have gone mad. Her granddaughter and the punishment of criminals were her pillars of sanity. Emma was holding on, partly because of her grandmother, and not without Caroline's help, trying to continue living in her new reality. The financial situation was visibly shaken, and Mrs. Isabella, after much deliberation, arranged a home council with her granddaughter. "Girl," said Mrs. Isabella, "I realize that we are going to have a difficult conversation, but I will not make important decisions without you. I know you don't throw away your home, but I'm sorry to have to rent it out. I'm afraid we'll end up with ruin instead of money. What do you think?" "Grandma, you're right. It would be too hard for me to stay there," Emma said. "I can't find a proper job yet, and I don't feel comfortable with you supporting me." the woman hugged her granddaughter tightly. She was glad Emma didn't cry. During the short but emotionally heavy conversation, the process of selling her daughter's flat began. During those tragically difficult days, as the woman thrashed around the city trying to get justice and dealing with other issues, Caroline had supported her friend. She'd even tried to drag Emma out to all sorts of fun events. But it was to no avail. However, Emma knew that Caroline had met some guy at one of the discos she couldn't get her out to. And now, after making sure her friend was in a relatively normal state, she was spending all her free time with him. Emma had a slip of resentment at the fact that it was as if Caroline was hiding her suitor from her. But it all became clear after another serious conversation with her grandmother. One day, Mrs. Isabella, who had aged sharply after the tragic events, seeing that her granddaughter was sad over her notes, sat down opposite her, and looking into her eyes, spoke. "My girl, I know that you had to grow up very early, but that's the way fate has it. Actually, that's not what I wanted to tell you. It's inevitable that you and Caroline are seeing less of each other. It was bound to happen one day. You can't be around everywhere, or it's not normal. You shouldn't be offended that she doesn't introduce you to her beau." "That's quite easily explained," said Mrs. Isabella. "It is the way of the world that love always comes before friendship." "But I'm not going to steal the boy away from Caroline," Emma objected indignantly. Grandmother smiled. "I didn't think so. Caroline doesn't suspect you of evil intentions, of course. But instinctively she's trying to spend more time with her boyfriend and not involve you in their meetings, so as not to dissipate his attention. Men are a windy people. Not all of them, of course, but alas, a great many. So I don't want you to take offense or be too trusting. I didn't tell you, but you have a right to know. Your parents, as it turns out, were killed by people they thought were good friends. Just remember that you can only trust yourself completely, unconditionally, and truly. Be especially careful when you fall in love. Happiness loves silence. The less you brag, the better." Emma nodded, listening to her grandmother. Everything was falling into place. Resentment against her friend evaporated like raindrops from the hot asphalt. The girl carefully memorized all the words of the only native person. She had always admired her grandmother, and now she was a little ashamed that she had left her favorite relative unattended. Of course now, having almost reached the right stop, it was silly to go back. All that remained was to perfectly fulfill her friend's request and get home faster. Scraps of triumphant, sad and instructive memories managed to rush through Emma's mind while they were traveling to the casting even before arriving at the place. The girl's musings were interrupted by Caroline's enthusiastic monologue, anticipating success. "Very soon we'll get our diplomas, and then hello, new life in the capital. The prospects will be better than in our small town." Emma thought she was used to her best friend's ambition and spontaneous actions. But Caroline still managed to surprise Emma, and she objected to her friend standing up for her hometown. "You're a bit of a bastard, Caroline, calling our city of over 1 million people a small town. That's just wrong. Besides, how's your boyfriend Anthony going to feel about it?" Something happened that had never happened in our long years of friendship. Caroline was embarrassed to hear such a question, and to avoid answering, she abruptly turned the conversation to the details of the upcoming performance. As they approached the contest venue, Emma's misgivings grew more and more preoccupied. Judging by the fact that the queue to the old building, which had once been a cinema, was stretched out in a thin snake almost halfway, long delays were becoming obvious. Two things. Firstly, the competition looks like it's going to be tough. And secondly, the casting is not organized in the best way. However, after the girls stood for about an hour amongst similarly eager to become famous in the field of dance, the queue suddenly began to move a lot faster. When Caroline and Emma finally waited their turn to perform, it became clear what the reason for this sudden acceleration was. They had barely had time to perform a couple of moves when the person sitting in the center of the jury table shouted, "Well done. Bravo. That's enough. Wait. In the next room, we need to discuss the concept of further development of your duet. There's water, tea, healthy sweets. Get some rest. You'll be invited to an interview later." Emma didn't care, because she had agreed to participate in the very initial stage at the insistence of her stubborn friend. But Caroline's hands were almost trembling. She was afraid to hear that the project didn't need a dance duet. Emma, sensing Caroline's excitement, whispered softly. I think I've accomplished my mission. Now I can refuse to participate in the competition, so as not to take the place of girls who dream of getting into the project. Caroline's heart was relieved, and she entered the improvised waiting room with the good mood provided by her best friend's support. The building used to be a cinema, as it had been when it was built, but it had been a cafe. So in a fairly spacious room that already held about 15 lucky people, Caroline and Emma had no trouble finding a seat for themselves. The atmosphere was nervous. The pretty middle-aged brown woman who was in charge of distributing supplies and keeping order was smiling sweetly at the contestants, pouring tea and water, offering candy and something that looked like homemade marshmallows. Emma refused the treats. Caroline, on the other hand, politely thanked the woman whose name Mia was on her jacket and enjoyed the sweets and tea. Sipping her drink, she whispered to her friend, "Why are you shy? This very Mia is here, as I think, for a reason. She's probably looking at the contestant's character. Whoever's rude to her is not going to make it past the qualifying round. Again, look how she looks at everyone carefully, especially if the girls sit in companies. In dance groups, like an astronaut, psychological compatibility is important. So she notices which group is more promising to form." Emma marveled. "But you, Caroline, you're just a consummate strategist." The girlfriend smiled. "That's just the way it is. You just don't know how much I want to get out of here and go to the capital. Parents constantly nagging study better. Do not go out late." Emma kept silent to keep from crying. She would have been happy to be told what to do by her mom and dad. Emma missed the times when the whole family was together. Thankfully, Emma's painful conversation was interrupted. An acquaintance from the dance studio came over to the girlfriends and they chatted for a while, reminiscing about the past. The conversation helped them forget a little about the tense situation. The number of contestants in the hall did not decrease, and those who went to the room for the interview were replaced by new ones. Soon an old maid of Caroline and Emma's was called in for an interview, and the two of them were called into the room next. In the room, sprawled on the sofa, half reclining, half sitting, was a man who from the first moment had made a most unpleasant impression on Emma. In a manner looking down on the girls from below, though looking upwards, he, slightly stretching his vowels, said, "I am the producer of this project. My name is Anthony. I have to be honest, I've been watching you move on the online camera, and it's impressive. You have a great duet, such cohesion, such harmony, and such plasticity. It's like you're moving without tension. I can see that you're enjoying your performance, and that's very much appreciated. In general, I am ready to make you a unique offer right now to employ you in a capital club. At first, of course, there will be a trial period, but all the tips are yours. Of course, you'll have to learn a little bit. We have our own specifics in our establishment, but I think you girls are talented, capable, and will easily cope." Emma couldn't contain her surprise. What, I wondered, would be a tip for a female member of a dance troupe? Caroline, who already had a picture in her mind of being applauded in a huge hall in the capital, suddenly thought about her friend's reasonable question. Anthony laughed nervously and explained, emphasizing the age of the contestants. "And it seems that minors were not allowed on our casting. So where did this naivety come from all of a sudden? Or do you want to break comedy here, batting your eyelashes? We'll have to dance at the club. The customers there are generous and hot." The producer never called the job what it probably was. But Emma realized she needed to get out of that room as quickly as possible. Taking Caroline under her arm, the girl correctly said goodbye. "I'm sorry to have taken up your time, but we have to go." And contrary to fears, neither Anthony nor anyone else held the girls back. They walked quietly out of the former cinema building into the street. The always cheerful Caroline sank back, realizing that she'd almost got herself into trouble. Emma cheered her up. "Don't worry, there'll be some proper auditions. In the meantime, let's get a taxi. I'm really worried about Gran." Caroline, who was feeling awkward, was uncomfortable to refuse, though she planned to give herself an extraordinary shopping spree to improve her mood. While the girls were in the taxi, Emma asked, "Let's not scare my grandmother with the truth about this fake casting. Let's just say it didn't work out. That's the real thing. She doesn't need to know the details." Sure, right away my friend agreed. I myself do not like to think that I was so easily fooled. You could have checked out the organizer's firm. Okay, I'll be smarter now. Thank you, Emma, for coming with me. Emma smiled at her friend, though frankly she was feeling a little queasy. She'd left her grandmother alone for this fraudulent casting, and she would never forgive herself if something bad happened during that time. To the girl's great relief, Mrs. Isabella was relatively fine. However, the woman promised her granddaughter that she would soon undergo a full examination. Don't worry, I'll pass all the doctors. In the polyclinic at the place of residence, the queue to the cardiologist was scheduled for 3 months in advance. The neurologist was on holiday. There was no endocrinologist at all. In fact, there were only therapists, an aunt, an ophthalmologist, and a gynecologist. Emma smiled sadly, remembering Caroline's comment about her hometown, and mentally agreed with her. Well, it's a city of millions, and the polyclinic in the city center has almost no doctors. At the urging of her granddaughter, who was worried about her health, Mrs. Isabella went to a private clinic, but Emma was adamant. Let's take the money left over from the sale of the flat out of the account, but you'll pass the doctors without such a long wait. The woman had no choice but to comply, and so began her epic journey of visiting the clinic, taking tests and undergoing examinations. Emma, of course, asked her grandmother about the results, but in the hustle and bustle before graduation, she simply did not have time to study what was stated in the statements. Mrs. Isabella was cheerfully reporting to her granddaughter that all the deviations from the norm were just age-related changes, which angered Emma. Nonsense. You're always young. In fact, Mrs. Isabella's health was not as good as she presented it to her granddaughter. In addition to diabetes, the cardiologist was concerned about her heart condition. But the clever woman did not panic and checked the diagnosis elsewhere, then at another clinic. But all the doctors were unanimous the condition was dangerous, and it was necessary to prepare for surgery. Mrs. Isabella diligently followed all the recommendations, and Emma was pleased to note that the feverish blush had disappeared from her grandmother's cheeks. The woman underwent the operation, and it seemed that a new and happy period of life was ahead of her. Having received diplomas, Emma and Caroline decided to open their own choreographic studio, where not only children, but also adults who decided to join dancing could come. The girls staked on an unusual approach. They offered visitors a mix of modern dances, as well as engaged in the production of movements of couples to wedding songs, using an idea from a film once seen. In addition, Emma decided that she would spend her free time sewing, learning from her grandmother. And because from the very beginning to promote the studio, this is not the fastest thing. And extra, saved or earned money will not hurt. Surprisingly, needlework fascinated the girl, helping to distract her from her worries. Moreover, Mrs. Isabella was a patient and knowledgeable teacher, and was happy to share with her granddaughter all the wisdom, which she knew a lot. After only a few months, justifying the most daring hopes of the owners, the studio became a success. Of course, the net profit was out of the question, but still the idea was a success. Emma was happy that she was doing what she loved, both at home and in the company of her best friend. What warmed her soul most of all was the thought that her grandmother did not have to finance their small family alone. All was well for nearly a year. Then suddenly Mrs. Isabella was gone. The girl came home and saw her grandmother lying on the sofa as if resting. She slowly went over to cover her with a plaid, because the flat was quite chilly, because the central heating had already been turned off, and traditionally frost had returned. As soon as the girl came closer, a scream of horror burst out, it seemed, from the very depths of her soul. It was obvious that her grandmother was now beyond saving herself from the cold. The excitement she had experienced had proved fatal to Mrs. Isabella. In the turmoil of saying goodbye to her only relative, Emma found her outlet in the studio, dissolving in the movements, and watching the dancers closely, the girl drove away her pain. Caroline, who seemed to be doing just fine, tried not to flash her happy eyes so as not to annoy her friend, and came to visit her less and less often. Emma was not offended who would want to talk to a sad person. She was disgusted with herself. For a long time, going through fabrics, which her grandmother had accumulated quite a lot of, the girl seemed to have conversations with her favorite relative, and it seemed that this was the only way she would be able, if not to forget about her heartache, then at least to reduce it. One evening, having lost track of time. The girl completely forgot about the rules of safety. When she heard the doorbell ring, she thought it was Caroline, whom she hadn't even seen today. Her friend had warned her that she couldn't make the class because of personal matters, and she'd probably dropped by to tell her something. Eventually, Emma opened the door without looking through the peephole and gasped. She saw an unfamiliar man with a box of cake in his hands. The girl muttered, "You must be mistaken," and started to close the door. However, the man did not allow her to do so and surprised her with an unexpected revelation. "Hello, Emma. How mature you've become. I don't recognize you. Well, I'm not proud. I'll introduce myself. My name is Mr. John Smith. I am your own grandfather." The girl grinned unkindly, remembering what her mother had told her. "Husband disappeared somewhere, left grandma when our mutual daughter went to school. And as far as I know from my mum, he only visited a couple of times. So, Mr. Smith, have a good day and goodbye." The man put his foot on the threshold so that Emma couldn't slam the door in his face as she intended, and in a stern tone that sent shivers down her spine, he said, "Granddaughter, I'm on fire. I own the flat in part. I never divorced my grandmother." She probably didn't care about this formality. "She didn't file for the elements. I got hot. So, dear granddaughter, excuse me, move over and let me pass." The stunned Emma, using all her strength, managed to put on the door chain and shouted to the uninvited visitor, "I'm going to call the police, so you know." The man only smirked. "Call all you want. Even better for you to make sure I'm telling the truth," Mr. Smith said. "I'll also tell you that my granddaughter is the only one who won't let me on the doorstep. I've got a specialty cake from the town of my childhood. I'm sure the cops will love it. I'm just afraid it's going to spoil a bit. So you'd better hurry them up. Tell them it's urgent. Granddad wants to buy you a drink. Go on, and I'll wait for you here." The man removed his foot. Emma slammed the door shut, locked it, and hesitated. Really, would she call the police now, and what would she say? "Come, because there is a relative unknown to me under my door. He does not threaten, does not attack." Thinking, the girl moved away from the door just in case and dialed her friend's number. Briefly explaining the situation to Caroline, Emma asked, "Help me out. I think your cousin knows someone in the police force. Ask him, if it's not too much trouble, how I should go about it." "Got it, don't worry. Give me 10 minutes and wait for my call." Caroline called her excited friend back even a little before the voice deadline and cheerfully informed her, "Wait, me and the backup will be here soon. You will not open the door until I tell you to." "Got it." Emma gave a sigh of relief. "Thank you, Caroline. I owe you one." The girl tiptoed towards the door to see what was going to happen and soon heard soft male voices. It was very difficult to make out who was talking about what, and Emma was cursing herself for insisting on good noise insulation during the renovation. It didn't take long, though. There was a knock at the door, and Caroline, parodying a cartoon character, proclaimed, "Open up, bears here then." In her own voice, she added, "It's okay." Emma let her friend, her cousin Ben, whom she knew a little, her uninvited grandfather, and a strange man into the flat. Caroline introduced him to Emma, and this is Mr. Jake Slow, one of the best lawyers around. He will help settle the matter with the least amount of effort. The man bowed his head and said in a pleasant baritone, although under such unexpected circumstances, "It's a pleasure to meet you. If you don't mind, let's all sit down at the table." Citizen Smith should calmly state the nature of his grievances. "Produce the documents," he has said, Mr. Slow. "If it's not too much trouble, Emma, I'll ask you to prepare receipts for the rent. You can do it for the last month or any month. It's not too fundamental." The lawyer's voice mesmerized the girl. She was already even glad of her grandfather's sudden intrusion, for this mishap had led to a pleasant acquaintance. While Emma went to the other room to get receipts, Mr. Slow had time to study the passport which the girl's grandfather had given him, and held out the document to Ben. "See for yourself, something about the marriage stamp looks odd to me." Cousin Caroline scrutinized the stamp and began to photograph all the pages of the passport. Mr. Smith raised an eyebrow in surprise, but before he could speak, the lawyer asked him an unexpected question: "What shop did you buy the cake from?" The man even proudly introduced himself. "You can't buy that here. In my hometown, in my only confectionery shop, they bake according to old recipes. I went in yesterday before I left and bought some. Mr. Slow nodded. I guess you and I, Mr. Smith, are countrymen. Only I haven't been back to my native land for perhaps 5 years. Who's in the pastry shop now? Is it the same Aunt Anne, with her eyelashes glued shut, and her constant quip in response to complaints about the order of the counters, more dirt, wider faces? Mr. Smith nodded. She is. The lawyer rejoiced as if he had been told the most joyous news. We must go and see how the deceased is still trading. Aunt Anne has been resting in the ground for about 15 years, replied Mr. Slow. I doubt if you are a relative of Emma's. Even if you were, according to the receipt she has kindly provided for the last 6 months, you are not even registered here. You have no right to this property. And if you're thinking of suing, you'll only waste your time and money. So my advice to you is to get out of here and don't show up in front of Emma again. Otherwise, I'll find an article under which you can be held administratively or even criminally liable, Mr. Slow said. After listening carefully, the elderly Mr. Smith grabbed his document with surprising ease and headed for the exit. Emma shouted after him, "Take the cake. I don't want anything from you." Mr. Smith did not resist or refuse, and left the flat he had failed to become a full-fledged tenant of. Emma was overjoyed and agreed to let her saviors go only after an impromptu feast. She sincerely thanked her friend Caroline, her cousin Ben, and the lawyer who had so masterfully got her out of trouble. Then she asked a direct question. "Mr. Slow, please name your fee." The man laughed, better just by name. "I'm maybe 7 years older only. And when people address me by my patronymic you, I feel like an old man. In fact, I think you've already paid for everything with your home-cooked meal and this curiosity." Caroline picked up the lawyer's laughter. They were laughing at the hapless impostor. "Neat, Jake, you exposed him. After all, didn't you take a passport photo of that con artist for something?" Caroline's cousin admitted, "Honestly, I just did it for solidity's sake. I thought I'd scare him by doing it. And I think it worked." When the guests left, Emma did not think that the strange incident would have a pleasant continuation. The next morning, however, Jake came to see her. He brought a coffee and a cake from a rather high-status coffee shop, explaining, "This is to apologize for not being able to taste the cake yesterday." The girl thanked the lawyer and, feeling a little awkward, offered to have breakfast together. During the conversation at the table, Emma had the feeling that she had known Jake all her life and that he understood her half-heartedly. They even had the same musical tastes, which wasn't even the case with Caroline, who couldn't stand rock or classical music. Emma wasn't even surprised that her companionship with Jake had become a necessity, a real addiction. Once during another date, the man reluctantly, as if embarrassed, shared with the girl a difficult story of his life. He said that he was married, and after the divorce he moved from his hometown of Littleton to the metropolis of New York, where he once studied. "That's how I was living before I met you, working, renting a flat close to the office, and I didn't even think I'd ever fall so much in love," Jake confessed. Emma's heart melted from the tenderness of Jake, with whom she felt like behind a stone wall. The girl once suggested to her favorite man to move in with her, and he agreed. As a confirmation of the seriousness of his intentions, he gave her a thin ring as an engagement ring and proposed to get married closer to summer. Can you imagine what a beautiful ceremony could be organized? No, winter also has its charms, but an enchanting photo shoot in nature will not be possible in any way. "And I want you to remember our wedding day forever," Jake said. Emma saw Caroline exclusively at work. One day, as she entered the tiny office they proudly called the coach's room, she found her best friend in tears. "What happened? Did you get hurt? Should I call a taxi to the hospital?" Emma asked. Caroline shook her head. "I'm sad. It's just that no one wants me." Emma marveled. "Really? I need you. Practice is in an hour. Everyone will be waiting for you there. Don't be sad." Caroline cried, "You don't even have time to hang out with me now. I don't even have anyone to go dancing with, just to relax with. I'm so lonely." Emma tactfully did not ask where the mysterious beau had gone, which made her friend's eyes shine so much, and suggested to her, "Why don't you come over to my place tonight?" Jake said he'd be working late. He's got somewhere to be. You and me, we're gonna relax. We'll organize a beauty salon at home, all sorts of masks, peeling, she suggested. The girls were in the middle of a fun conversation when Jake returned to the flat. He said hello to Caroline, kissed Emma, and after a moment's thought, invited the girls to an Italian cafe. Since that evening, the man had also taken an active part in making sure his beloved's friend didn't feel neglected and lonely. And at weekends, the groom took the bride and her friend to a country park hotel for a picnic with kebabs or rented a house at a camp where they could go skiing and snowboarding. Emma was genuinely glad that her friend had stopped shedding tears. In addition, things in business also went uphill. The girls had even opened a branch of the studio and had not hesitated to entrust Jake with the paperwork. Emma dreamed that soon her beloved would take her to apply. She had learnt in advance the schedule of the registry office, all the formalities and details, and waited for the fateful day to come. However, the man was alert and affectionate. But even though the last spring month was already over the middle, he did not talk about the official registration of the relationship. Probably Emma would go for some time, as they say, with rose-colored glasses, and did not suspect anything. But one day during a dinner together, she had to leave the company of her fiancé and best friend to talk on the phone with the mother of one of the girls studying in the studio. When Emma returned to the table, she almost caused a scandal when she saw Caroline kissing Jake. The deluded bride had to summon all her self-control to almost calmly report, "So Jake, I understand you're worried, so give me your set of keys. I'll get your stuff together and let you know when you can pick it up." "Caroline, will you give me back my flat keys too?" said the deluded bride almost calmly, summoning all her self-control to her aid. Her friend, however, was not embarrassed, and rummaging in her purse, said in a perfectly mundane tone anyway, "I'm glad it's finally cleared up. Yes, Jake and I are together now. But come on, don't make a tragedy out of it." "Okay," Caroline said. "I'd like our business not to suffer because of your possible offense. Be professional. I realize it's going to be hard for you to see me. So I suggest we temporarily not cross paths until you cool off. Otherwise, it's scary you'll have steam coming out of your ears." Caroline smiled victoriously, dumping a bunch of keys out of her bag. Taking the keys to Emma's flat off the carabiner, she continued to outline her ideas. "We'll split the studios like this. The one closest to my house will be mine. You can safely train in the branch, pay minimum rent, and half of the profit that you will have you can take for yourself. The rest will be saved in accounts for future development. Seems reasonable and fair to me." Emma wondered, "Wait, Caroline, are you kidding me? Why on earth would I suddenly have to pay rent and give away profits? I'm actually just as much an owner as you are." Jake tried to reassure the girl he'd just dumped and lost a large part of his income because of her gullibility. "We're not scandalizing. People are already looking back at us. Kitten, understand, it happens. Don't blame yourself. You're a wonderful person, a talented and beautiful girl. You'll be fine. Let's stay friends." Caroline teased, "Let's civilize our relationship under new circumstances. I think you're being overdramatic. I mean, you're the best dance coach in the world. But in business, I'm sorry you don't understand anything. Who signs papers like general powers of attorney, amendments to bylaws without looking? Jake and I are going to run the business. You do what you do best, show me how to dance." Emma remembered that indeed, trusting solely in Jake's verbal recounting without even reading, she had signed a few sheets and flared up. "So you're trying to make me look like a benefactor by knocking me off my feet and taking away the joy of doing what I love?" "Oh, you're so good," Emma said indignantly. "But be warned, I will not give up. I'm not going to let you wipe your feet all over me." Grabbing her purse, Emma ran home, not looking back at the calls to stop that the traders shouted after her. At home, running from room to room, turning to the kitchen and bathroom, she grabbed Jake's things she saw and threw them on the bed. Then she tied up the corners of the bedspread and dragged the unexpectedly heavy knot to the door so she could shove it over the threshold as soon as her ex-fiancé arrived. Finished clearing the flat of Jake's belongings, Emma rushed through the papers she had at home. The more the deceived girl immersed herself in reading, checking the meanings of terms on the internet when necessary, the more horror enveloped her. How naive she had been. How insanely gullible. How right her grandmother had been in saying that one should never trust anyone unconditionally. Such a blow from Caroline, whom she considered her best friend, and from her fiancé, Emma couldn't have imagined even in her worst nightmare. The power of attorney she'd given Jake had played a very bad trick. The man had taken advantage of her boundless trust and legally arranged it, so that Emma had almost no rights to the studio. She was no longer a co-owner, but an ordinary employee, and could not even take a holiday or set a convenient working schedule without Caroline's agreement. Emma could have quit now, of course, but she decided to work for at least a month so that she could prepare her escape route, rent a space, and set up a new studio, luring in as many clients as possible. She hadn't even spoken to Jake, who'd come to pick up her things. As soon as the bundle with his things was on the landing, she hurried to close the door. Emma went to her beloved studio as if it were hard labor. And after a week, the flow of clients noticeably decreased. Even regular pupils and students began to refuse from classes. Emma blamed herself, thinking that the training lacked enthusiasm and the spark that ignites talent in people who are shy to dance. But one day, one of the first visitors, who became a regular, opened her eyes to what was going on. It turned out that Caroline brazenly simply lures customers to her room, not disdaining any methods. The most harmless method of her ex-girlfriend, a lie that Emma is supposedly going to go away, and therefore she does not have time for classes. Thanking for the valuable information, the girl said goodbye to the visitor and went to the coach's room on wobbly legs. She wanted to take her things quickly and, having got home, to have a proper rest. However, she decided first of all to write to her former friend that she was quitting. She immediately fulfilled her intention. The reply message that arrived in the messenger on her phone completely knocked Emma out of her rut. It was a picture of a framed invitation to Caroline and Jake's wedding reception. And with the mocking caption +1 before she could catch her breath, another message arrived: "We would like you not to be angry with us and to share our moment of joy. The uniforms are dressy. Caroline and Jake." Emma was shocked. What had she done to humiliate her like this? Why were the people she thought were her pillars of strength now pushing her into the abyss of despair? Had she misjudged them so deeply? The girl did not know what to do, but clearly understood that in such a state, alone and no way to stay. It is necessary to be somewhere among people, so that the sinful thoughts of the most terrible way of solving problems did not get into her head. Emma went to the nearest park. There are a lot of people there, and at the same time no one's personal space is invaded. If Emma's state of mind could influence nature, the lead gray sky would light up with lightning. People trying to hide from the weather would have been hit in the face by prickly rain, and wind gusts would have torn down the marquees of established street cafes. Except that it was almost the opposite. The mood of one unhappy, humiliated girl did not change anything. The sun shone brightly in the sky. The young greenery on the trees gave a nice thick shade, and the park looked perfect. The unknown landscape designer had obviously tried to create a magnificent landscape, and he had done everything with a soul. The park was much cozier than Emma remembered, and she sat down on a bench to try to get away from all the excitement that had almost made her sick today. She felt like she was performing on stage, and once again the music disappeared. Only this time the girl had no idea what dance she was doing or what tune was playing at all. All that was left was to freeze in confusion and desperately try to figure out what to do next. Right in front of the bench where the girl had settled down were late varieties of proud tulips, which looked, if not winners in life, then definitely masters of the flower beds. I wish I had their self-confidence, thought Emma. And her thoughts were suddenly interrupted by a man's voice. "Why are you crying?" Emma, who hadn't noticed she was crying, had no intention of talking to anyone and said nothing to the curious stranger. He went away but soon returned and sat down beside the sad Emma. The stranger had 2 ice creams in each hand and a fluffy cloud of candy floss. The man began to patiently explain to stop the girl who was about to jump up and run away from him. "Don't be frightened, Emma. But I happen to know you even though we are strangers. I work for a private investigator who was commissioned by your grandmother to work on solving your parents' murder, since we seriously feared that the villains would use every means to affect the course of justice. My boss instructed me to keep an unspoken eye on you. So I guess you could say you've been under my tacit surveillance for months," the man continued. Emma took a closer look at him. He might have glimpsed her once around, but she couldn't be firmly sure of that. The stranger, smiling, introduced himself. Sam Swan, an employee of the secret private agency. After introductions, the man handed Emma an ice cream cone and candy floss, explaining. "They said in the cinema that ice cream seemed to make it more fun, but I thought you might have a sore throat. So I got you some candy floss. I, for one, love cotton candy." Emma was in a bad mood, and she didn't answer Sam very kindly. "You may enjoy it. I try not to eat any of those kinds of sweets." The man smiled. "Well, no, you don't. Really, I can't eat that much myself. Wait, I'll treat those boys who are counting change at the kiosk and I'll be back." She didn't know why, but Emma obeyed and waited for Sam. The assistant detective asked, "You may consider this a professional inquiry, and if you're uncomfortable with it, you don't have to answer. But I'll ask you this, why are you crying on such a lovely day in this beautiful park?" Emma grinned and decided to share her distress. "It might have been a lovely day if it weren't for one thing. Today, 2 traitors have taken to inviting me to a wedding. My ex-fiancé is going to, what was it called, solemnize his marriage to my former best friend. And it's a mock invitation. It's for 2 people. They know I don't have anyone to go with. They're mocking me. I just don't understand why." Without knowing why, the girl briefly told Sam the sad story of her failed love, and the man even whistled. "Listen, Emma, you may not believe this, but my gut tells me that someone elegantly set up your acquaintance with this Jake. You say he seemed to know everything about you, took you at your word, shared your interests. That's pretty smooth. Did you hear the name of Ben, who took your grandfather's passport photos?" The girl answered in the negative but asked, "Why do you need this information?" Sam didn't hold back. "You know, your grandmother was more than generous. I got a very large sum of money for my work, much more than I expected. I found out later from my boss that Mrs. Isabella even sold some of her things to pay for it. You know, I was ashamed of it," Sam continued. "I was young, and I needed the money. Anyway, I didn't pay your grandmother back part of my fee, like I wanted to. I saw you today, and that old feeling of shame came over me. So I guess now I have to sort of return the change in the form of finding out the truth about that grandfather and your ex-fiancé. If you want, come by the agency in 2 days. I'll give you my card with the address and phone numbers, or we can meet at any other place of your choice." The girl, who had been suspicious of Jake's exact match of tastes and attitudes during the conversation with Sam, looked at the card and answered, "I'll come round to the agency the day after tomorrow. It'll be more convenient for me." Emma walked home and thought, indeed, how strange her acquaintance with Jake was developing. It was as if the man knew exactly the way to her heart. He'd even used exactly the kind of perfume she liked, with a top note of lemon and a persistent trail. It wasn't the most obvious choice for the serious, successful lawyer Jake seemed to be. Emma had noticed that he'd crinkled his nose a few times when she danced to the tune of her favorite rock band, even though he claimed to adore their work. When asked why his face grimaced, the man very convincingly, as it seemed to Emma in love at the time, answered about sudden cramps or headaches. Closely examining her memories of the recent past, the jilted bride found more and more oddities. When she got home, Emma was convinced that Jake had done everything he could to gain her trust and move into her flat as her fiancé. Admittedly, he'd succeeded with ease. But what was his goal? Emma kept no cash in the flat. A sewing machine, fabrics and remnants of the family jewelry collection, that was all the valuables the girl had. Obeying her inner fear, Emma checked the stash. A pair of antique earrings and a ring were there. The girl calmed down a little, but the next morning she took the jewelry and went to the bank to put it in a safe deposit box. There was no guarantee that Jake hadn't taken care of the duplicate key. Besides, Caroline could have done that too. After her visit to the bank, she planned to call a locksmith to change the lock, just in case. So, having signed a contract for a safe deposit box and placed the jewelry there, she decided to withdraw the accumulated interest from the account so that she could have cash on hand. However, an employee of the financial institution shocked Emma with the news. "I'm sorry, but under your power of attorney, all the funds were withdrawn from the account yesterday," she said. Emma tried not to shout. Emma clarified. "Tell me, and who did I give the power of attorney to? Can you look at it?" The employee did not refuse the strange client and gave a name Emma had never expected to hear. It wasn't Jake who'd taken the money from the account, as she'd assumed, but her ex-best friend. She thanked the operator, who asked her if everything was all right, and wandered home. It was clear as day that Caroline was the one who could have so accurately guided Jake about her likes and dislikes. Not only did her friend know the naive Emma, it was at her behest and at her instruction that the man had managed to present himself in the image of the ideal. She believed in the incredible harmony and love at first sight. Now there was an explanation, and the fact that Caroline had pressed her pity, cursing her loneliness, was also part of the plan. Surely when they'd invited her to the wedding, the traitors must have been up to something devious, too. Maybe someone would be brought in to raid the flat while Emma, swallowing tears, would give them words of congratulations. After all, her friend knew for a fact that she still had her jewelry. Only she'd never told her where the stash was located in the house. Emma did not go to the police about the theft of money, because technically Caroline had a power of attorney, and there was no doubt that it was signed by a real signature. The foreman replaced the lock in the door, and the girl felt a little calmer. She couldn't relax completely, however. Emma decided to use the insomnia to her advantage. She began to think about an outfit to make a spectacular appearance at the wedding of the people who had betrayed her trust. Barely having waited for working hours, the girl appeared in the office of the agency secret. Following the clues of the guard sitting near the turnstile, she found the door, on which hung a sign with the name of a recent acquaintance, and knocked. Entered. Before Sam could tell the girl the information she'd gleaned, she confessed. "You know, I guess you were right. Jake was briefed by my best friend. She took money out of my account by proxy, by the way. But it was my fault. I signed every piece of paper my fiancé gave me. It's my fault." Sam confirmed it. "Yeah, I managed to talk to Caroline's cousin, Ben. He's probably the most innocent element in this scheme. In my opinion, he was used as a front. He's a big guy, and his main job was to scare the guy who said he was your grandfather." Catching the surprise on Emma's face, Sam explained. "It was a well-thought-out production. I understand Caroline knew the basic information about your family. Jake found an actor to play Mr. John Smith. You'd only seen old photographs of your grandfather when he was young, so there was no fear of exposure. The crooks wanted to get rich, and as I understand it, they almost succeeded. I think they didn't invite you to the wedding just to make fun of you, but with the same vested interest. After all, you caught them unexpectedly, and he just didn't have time to bring the search of your flat to its logical conclusion." Emma nodded. "I've come to roughly the same conclusion. I just have a few questions bouncing around in my head. Why did my best friend, who was there for me in my most difficult moments, suddenly decide to betray me? Why would she do that to me? It's not like we've never even had a serious fight." Sam surmised. "Maybe jealousy or greed? Those are usually the main motives behind most crimes." Emma's face even stretched a little in surprise. "My family wasn't much richer than Caroline's originally, so it's definitely not greed. And as for jealousy, it wasn't me she was jealous of, it was my friend I was jealous of. Ever since my parents had died, I'd been crazy to imagine that Caroline could play checkers with her dad, hug her mum, and talk to her in confidence. I was overcome with envy. What can I say? I still have that feeling now. Maybe she's getting back at me for my envy. I don't think so. Anyway, I don't know what to think. I'm in a lot of pain right now with everything that's going on. I know one thing for sure, I'm going to the wedding of those traitors. If only so that I can look at Jake and Caroline and see why they did such a despicable thing to me." The assistant detective explained. "Jake's motives are pretty clear. He was driven by greed. He's got so much debt in his hometown, he's got a lot of debt to pay. He's a mediocre lawyer, but his demands are such that he can't afford the average fees. He also had addictions. He got out of town by swindling several ladies out of large sums of money, promised marriage. He took money under plausible pretenses and quarrels. He was treated at a private clinic in our area. Gave the doctors almost everything he had from his naive country women for his rehabilitation. Now he's back on the hunt for riches. Do not worry. We will definitely try to get you back in the dance studio and the money. But in the meantime, don't make a fuss, or Jake and Caroline might just run away. And I want them to be punished fairly." Emma began to thank the man, and Sam sighed. "I've been able to find so much information on Jake these days. It's amazing. I mean, he's not stupid enough to do anything dishonest. He's a real master, but he's probably overconfident. You want me to tell you all the tricks he's pulled in this town right now? Or better wait. And then at the wedding you'll see everything. Although Emma had a desire to know everything at once, she, after a little thought, answered, I think I'll wait. I don't feel like getting deeper into the mud right now. I've had enough of what I've learned so far. There are only 2 problems left: what to wear and who to go with. I'm working on the first one, but I don't know what to do about the second. Sam, why don't you keep me company? Don't think I'll pay for the escort, because that's a separate job. The man shook his head negatively. No, I'm not fit for a spectacular appearance. My appearance is ordinary, unremarkable, and, to be honest, even mediocre. But you come with me on your arm, and what? Only at the first moment your detractors will feel pleasure. They'll say they couldn't persuade anyone better. If you're going to make a spectacular appearance, you have to deal them a crushing blow, so that they'll be in a bad mood. Listen, I think I know just the man for you. If it works out, it'll be amazing. And if it doesn't, I'll keep you company, of course. It may not be the most glamorous exit, but I'll give you some amazing information. Emma agreed with Sam that they would meet half an hour before the wedding and agreed on the place. Saying goodbye, the girl went to the needlework shop to buy fittings for her planned outfit. She had only 2 weeks left to create a stunning dress. Not the shortest of deadlines, but the idea wasn't too simple either. Emma was nervous and stabbed her fingers with a needle several times until they bled. In order not to cry from resentment and pain, the girl remembered her grandmother's words that by omen a thing sown with such incidents will definitely turn out perfect. The girl did not have to rush to work, and she missed her classes. But she wasn't going to go to Caroline's house and ask to go back. Emma was warmed by the thought that it was likely that the studio would soon be in her possession again, though her gullibility had already failed her. The girl trusted Sam to be honest with her. On the day of Jake and Caroline's wedding, Emma had looked truly dazzling. She looked like a tongue of flame with both color and vague associations. The top of the dress had a daring asymmetrical neckline, and the flared skirt with high slits at the seams fluttered playfully as she walked, revealing nothing too much, but perfectly arousing her imagination. Emma knew she was irresistible in that dress, but Sam's praise pleased her. She realized from his plain clothes that her companion would be someone else, and was incredibly surprised when the man who had once tried to pass himself off as her grandfather approached her, the detective's assistant. He embarrassingly introduced himself. Mr. Brown is an unemployed provincial theater actor, but necessity forced him to play the role of a con man in the hope of being trusted. Pardon my deception if you can. Emma's heart was pounding as before an important performance, but she pulled herself together. She took Mr. Brown under her arm and walked with him towards the restaurant rented from the businessman. At the entrance, they were suddenly met by Caroline's parents, who greeted their daughter's friend very warmly and regarded her companion with undisguised interest. The bride's mum cordially invited. "Oh, Emma, how glad I am that you have come. Come in. Almost everyone is already gathered there. Have fun, relax, be happy for Caroline and her fiancé. Such a fine man. I hope you get lucky one day. You deserve it." Emma was having a hard time with this conversation, and as if sensing it, her companion squeezed her hand a little harder. Caroline's father admired the way his daughter's friend looked, being rewarded with a disgruntled look from his wife, who dragged him along. "Have you forgotten where the steward has directed us? Come quickly, I'll see you, Emma." The woman spoke almost at a run, dragging her husband after her. As Emma and Mr. Brown crossed the threshold of the banqueting hall, she was pleased to note that Caroline and Jake had frozen like statues when they saw the guests. The bride and groom didn't look happy at all. With some control over their emotions, they waved to Emma and her companion. Caroline reached for the groom's ear. "What's that drunk doing here? You told me he'd get the money he's owed and drive off where no one could find him." Jake put his arm around his fiancée, pulled her close, and replied, "I don't think Emma has anything serious planned against us. It's just someone who looks like her. She has a good visual memory. She may have guessed that Grandpa showed up on her doorstep not by accident, but so I could get to her quickly and without suspicion. So she decided to annoy us, to demoralize us, to poison the joy of our happy day. She thought about it, recalled what this supposed Mr. John Smith looked like, and hired someone. There are plenty of actors in the country dreaming of an easy way to make money. So relax, Caroline. Emma and her companion tried to act as if nothing had happened, and not to stand out from the rest of the guests in any way, neither by being overjoyed nor by frowning. Thanks to the lady hostess, they found their table almost instantly and sat down, waiting for the start of the party, which promised to be very special. Emma was pleased to note how anxiously Caroline was looking at her. And meeting her gaze, she smiled as sweetly as possible. She had no idea what kind of surprise Sam had prepared, but she was excited. At a signal from the hostess, Caroline's parents brought a huge loaf into the banquet hall, and the fun began in full swing. The guests congratulated the newlyweds. The bride's parents sang a duet song. The aunt on the groom's side organized a long presentation of small souvenirs to rhyme. Emma was getting more and more worried, but Mr. Brown reassured her, and when the steward announced it was their turn to congratulate the newlyweds, the man whispered quietly, "Well, Emma, here we go. Let me do the talking, and you listen and be glad you learned about the real nature of your ex-fiancé in time." Caroline coughed with excitement, and Emma's companion, carefully supporting her, took a seat in the middle of the hall. The experienced actor didn't even need a microphone. His well-pitched voice, which surprisingly had not lost its sonority after years of libations, was heard in all corners of the hall. "So, ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Brown addressed the audience. I suggest we turn our attention to the screen." The hostess switched off several rows of lamps and the room became much darker. Suddenly, to the sound of Mendelssohn's March, racy images of the groom with other women began to appear on the screen. Mr. Brown accompanied the changing images with brief information about the names of the groom's lovers. When Jake came to his senses, he tried to shout out the unexpected guest and convince everyone else that the image on the screen was a photo montage. But a seed of doubt had been planted. Caroline seemed to be completely unaware of her fiancé's amorous nature, and after the photo of Jake and Emma's company had been followed by shots of her, and the unusual film continued with other ladies, she slapped her fiancé and shouted at him, unashamedly, "Gad, you said you only cheated Emma. We're going to live happily ever after. You got me to help you take her dance studio away from her. And he's only hooking me up for profit. I should have known better than to follow you. You decided to get married. And then what were your plans? Run away with the money you gave me? Take my business away from me too? I hate you." Finally, Jake's display of unfaithfulness was over. The lights came back on, and Sam Swan entered the room, escorted by police officers. "Unfortunately, the festivities will have to come to an end," he explained. "The main celebrants are suspected of fraud." Caroline's parents rushed to the law enforcement officers to explain that there had been a mistake, but the police were adamant. Jake and Caroline were handcuffed and led to the exit. As the ex-girlfriend approached Emma, the girl asked her a question. "Why did you do this to me? I always thought you were someone I could trust." Caroline braced herself and blurted out, "You always got everything without a problem. First places, inheritances, even the students gravitated towards you, not me." Emma was shocked. She was trying to figure out if Caroline was being sincere, if she had almost ruined her life out of jealousy, just as Sam had suggested. Caroline spat angrily and confessed, "You've always been the best. Ever since sports camp, and I've been a pale shadow of you. You know what I'm going to tell you? I hate you. Ever since I saw you dancing. If you must know, I'm the one who tried to ruin your performance. I'm the reason the music stopped playing during your dance. But things turned out in your favor." Caroline paid no attention to anyone around her and, looking into Emma's eyes, reported, "The only moments I've ever been truly happy, you know what they were." Emma remained silent, afraid to even speculate, and Caroline grinned crookedly, continuing, "I was ready to jump for joy when you were suffering. How hard it was to hide your joy, to feign sympathy." A distraught Caroline tried to throw herself at Emma, but it wasn't easy to do so in handcuffs. The cops led the detainee away. Emma remained standing in the middle of the hall. She had yet to come face to face with her ex-fiancé, but he passed her by, barely glancing at her cleavage. "Jake, aren't you ashamed?" Emma asked after him. But the man didn't even turn round. "There's no shame in people like that," Sam Swan said loudly. At the request of Caroline's parents, Emma did not claim the money she had withdrawn from the account, but invested the compensation she had received in the development of her network of dance studios. For her, the situation with her ex-girlfriend and ex-fiancé was a great life lesson, and she was distrustful of the idea of dating, which was expressed by Sam. It took the assistant private detective about 3 years for Emma to finally believe in the sincerity of his feelings.